Hey, sorry about that, friends. I was just giving introductions and stuff like that, and then looked at the screen and realized I was muted. So I'm not 100% sure what you guys heard, but I'm going to assume you heard nothing and restart. My apologies. Shalom and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Welcome to Un-Apologetics, where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I got a very special episode here for you guys today. We will be, let me get this camera on. We will be joined actually by Rob Rowe of Sentinel Apologetics. And we're going to have a conversation that'll be not on one topic in particular, but we kind of just are going to have a general topic, talk probably about biblical literalism. We might focus towards some certain topics that we've talked about before, as well as a topic that we might end up debating here soon on the gospel truth. In fact, this may even be the announcement of that. I'm not 100% sure if that's been confirmed yet, but maybe Rob can help if I've misunderstood anything in that conversation there. But that's what's actually happening today. It was very impromptu by the grace of God. We've been able to get this and also a talk with Michael, the Canadian atheist, yesterday. Very impromptu conversations, both of them. But I think very good conversations, very beneficial for what we're trying to do here, as far as not only, of course, the channel itself getting publicity, but of course the bigger thing, getting an actual dig into truth. Because that, and I think the more philosophically poignant and theologically poignant these conversations get, the more we get to, the closer we get to digging for that truth, right? Because there's this, that, and the other thing that we can talk about. But when we're actually discussing the nature of truth and what scriptural truth actually is, I think that's when we're getting, closer and closer to the bullseye, so to speak. So before we get into that, though, there are a couple things I do want to announce and say. So going into the announcements first, we do have a interview coming up on the 15th of April. So this month, I'm going to be interviewing David Roll of Patterns of Evidence, the main scholar behind Patterns of Evidence and the main scholar behind actually the new Chronology. He will be on a episode of Un-Apologetics with us on April 15th, 8 a.m. my time, which is Mountain Time, whatever time that happens to be for you guys. If you can't catch it live, that's fine. It will be archived, but we'll be having that conversation with him, of course, talking about the Exodus, talking about Moses' existence, talking about why he believes his new chronology provides solid evidence for the biblical narrative. And you guys definitely will not want to be missing that one. But also, though we don't have the name or the date, excuse me, we do have the week. We'll be actually interviewing Bruce Gore the following week, either Wednesday or Thursday of that following week. So that would be either the 22nd or 23rd. Bruce Gore is a church historian, Sunday school teacher, and YouTube apologist. A lot of people will probably know here in the YouTube sphere, Bruce Gore. He's got about 30K subscribers. He goes through the Bible in historical context. And the interview with him is it's not going to be a refutation of Dr. Roll or anything like that, but what it will be is actually just providing the conventional and more traditional Exodus narrative and presenting the case for that, right? So we're obviously very blessed to have that as well. I have just received confirmation about 15 minutes ago that we will be able to get an interview at some point, though there has not been dates set, with Chris Date of Rethinking Hell, talking about annihilationism. And hopefully, if all things go according to plan, we are hoping to get both a debate with Matt Slick on the question of annihilationism, but also an interview with Matt Slick discussing issues of compatibilism. We don't have confirmation on that, but we may end up getting those things going. And so a lot of things to be looking forward to here on the channel. And I really appreciate you guys being here for all of it with me. We're going to go ahead and say a prayer, and then I have a brief message, and then we're going to go ahead and get right into our conversation with Rob, because I've already taken up 5 minutes of time. So let's go ahead and pray. If you guys would like to join me, I certainly would encourage you to do so. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for everything you've blessed us with here today, Lord. I want to thank you for the opportunity to have these conversations today, Lord Jesus, and to study your word in such a luxurious manner, Lord. We have so much information at our fingertips, but also the ability to speak about these things freely, to speak about these things to people who are on the other side of the world, Lord Jesus. This is such an amazing time to live in, and I pray that we use this wisely, Lord, as a means to get deeper understanding of you, deeper revelation of you, deeper relationship with you, Lord Jesus. I pray that you use this video for nothing more than your glorification and the glorification of your name, Lord. Let the both of me and Rob decrease, that you may increase, Lord Jesus, and let both of us be sharper as a result of this, Lord. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name, and I give you the glory. Amen. All right. So, real brief message I wanted to get at. Now I am hearing contradictory reports. So, I wanna tread lightly here. There's some indication on Twitter that he might actually still be around. There is also some floating around in some sources that he might not. But there is rumor floating around that the rapper DMX has passed away. That may actually not be true. But he is on life support from a drug overdose and in a vegetative state, has been for, I think, 3 days, if I am remembering correctly. This is, of course, a horrible situation. We want to, of course, have prayers for him and his family. I actually should have included prayers for him and his family in the prayer I just had. I kind of feeling a little convicted on that now that I'm thinking about it. But DMX, for those of you who do not know, many people may know DMX just as a hip hop artist in the gangster rap genre, who was, popular long ago and far away. Some people may not know him at all because his music was popular in the early to mid 2000s. But for those who don't know, DMX has actually had a long and very, very rough, very brutal struggle, not only with drug addiction, but with faith. And of course, those are related in that his struggle with faith has made him also struggle with his drug addiction, his behaviors and things like that. Right. He has wanted to leave the rap game and the drugs and the crime and all that and become a minister for some time. But of course, he's been having these issues going back, to the dog going back to their vomit, as the Bible says, right? As we've all been there, right? I'm sure any one of us who is honest can admit they've been that dog. And it's a very heartbreaking story in that, if he does pass now, or if he has passed already, depending on how that actually works out, that would be sad, right? How much greater would it be if he actually were able to conquer these horrible things in the name of Christ, to the glory of Christ, and actually rise above them, become a minister to people in the prison system, things like that, right? We would be losing a lot of potentiality there. And of course, God knows, and God allows all things for good for those who are called according to his purpose. I'm not questioning in any way, shape, or form DMX's salvation. But what I am saying is I think we should take this as an opportunity to be ready, be vigilant. And this is a message to me as much as it's a message to anybody else. Try as much as you possibly can, get these things out before they literally take your life or cause some other serious problems. And also pray for DMX, that he pulls through this to the glory of God, that he pulls through his drug addictions to the glory of God, that he be a beacon of light to those who are struggling with the things that he's struggling with. Because everybody needs somebody who's like them going through it for hope, right? And I think DMX could be a great hope for people. So pray for him, pray for his family, and use this maybe as a warning to yourself to try and get some fire under your butt, so to speak, and live for Christ. And with that, we're going to completely change the topic. Rob is here with me today. How's it going, Rob? I appreciate you being here with me.
I'm doing good, brother. This is just one of those impromptu discussion things. We were in conversation via the Gospel Truth earlier today, and I was like, hey, we can still have a casual chat. Like, we don't have to wait till July. So
right, exactly. Yeah. By the way, I do see here, so Slam says update, DMX is still on life support. Online rumors of his passing are false. That is also what we got a little earlier before the stream, so good to hear there. But at any rate, back to this here. So for those of you who do not know, and that's actually everybody now, because this was just confirmed all of like 20, maybe 30 minutes ago. Me and Rob will actually be having a debate on whether or not the flood was universal according to the Bible on July 1st on the Gospel Truths channel. And I think that's all actually set in stone now at this point, if I'm not mistaken. Is that accurate, Rob?
Did Marlon actually put it out there? Like, did he actually?
I guess I'm not sure. I don't know if he said he was going to work on the thumbnail and all that. I don't think he's gotten anything up on his channel quite yet.
Okay. Well,
but I think
we are saying it first then.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll actually be having that, and that'll be a little bit of time from now, July 1st, so a little over 2 months. But we'll be discussing, like I said, and maybe universal isn't the right word, because I guess if you take like a Hugh Ross position where it's like all of humankind but not of the whole planet, that would count as universal. So what we're debating is global, whether or not the flood is global according to the scripture. So that'll be a fun conversation, and you've heard it here first, I guess. That'll also be the first time I'm going to be on the Gospel Truth, actually, so that'll be fun. But that is what is the catalyst for today's conversation. We just kind of, Rob reached out, said, we don't have to, like he was saying, we don't have to wait for July to actually talk. And so, yeah, here we are. We're going to have a conversation. Maybe this will be the first of many. I guess we'll see. And yeah, I'm happy that you decided to do this. Actually, I appreciate you a lot.
Sweet.
So to give a little more brief background, this will also lead us to get the conversation actually going, right? Our first interaction was on S.J. Thomason's channel, right?
It was a bit tense.
A little bit. I certainly came in hot a little bit on that. I'll admit that for sure. But you had been asked a question by Michael the Canadian Atheist, which ironically that actually ended up being my first conversation with him too. But at any rate, and it was about whether or not the two specific miracles in the Bible had literally occurred. The first was the fall of the walls at Jericho, and the second was the elongated day, right? And well, rather than me actually representing your position, why don't you go ahead and represent your position, and that'll just be a good way for us to get right into the conversation, right? So that people know where you're coming from, and I don't have any straw men here or anything.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the long day. So I was talking with that Canadian atheist guy. To be honest, I wasn't even going in to talk with anyone. I just saw SJ live, and I haven't spoken with SJ, I think, maybe 6 months before that live stream. Maybe sooner, maybe 3 months, but it felt like a while. And here I am walking in, and there's Nathan, the Canadian atheists, and maybe one other person, but practically doing what they usually do, which is disparaging the Bible and being a little bit immature in their reasons. And I couldn't hold my tongue anymore, so I decided to chime in, respond in a little bit. And my story is more just to give you yourself personally. Because I don't think we've actually sort of like discussed each other's testimonies, but I've been a Christian for about 5 years, but my journey's been about 10 years. So 2010 was my grandfather's passing, and that kickstarted the whole thing. And so basically a 5-year journey of wrestling with, because I'm coming from a scientific background, so my mind thinks analytically. So just what the heck is this thing called death, right? And my two questions I asked, obviously you're having discussions with the pastor and with family. So I hail from a European descent. So obviously responses are like, God works in mysterious ways, and this is just the natural function of life. It's the circle of life sort of thing. And so I had like an epiphany moment. I was 21 at the time, and I was like, look, if God exists, what's the most efficient means? And the key word here is efficient and sufficient. So what's the most efficient means he can solve this thing called death if he does exist? Like, surely he knows about this thing known as death and all that. And if he wanted to, like, what would be the most efficient means he can solve it? And if he also, if he exists, what's the most sufficient means he can show himself that he does exist, and then simultaneously to solve this death question? And so, yeah, that led down to basically a John 1:14 and John 1:18 element. So those two verses, in those 5 years of, looking into literally everything. And again, when in fact, a lot of Christian testimonies sort of say the same thing, like, we looked into everything. So in a way, I could be a bit hyperbolic in that statement, but I'm also at the same time being quite serious. Like, I genuinely looked at cutting edge stuff and also a lot of weird stuff. And yeah, those two verses summarize the answers to those questions. In other words, if Jesus exists and if the resurrection exists, then that's all you need ultimately at the end of the day. So then, when I'm engaging with these folk online, like that Canadian atheist, I already have that baggage of the scholarship behind me. So when I look at, for example, Joshua 10 and the Long Day, I'm most sensitive to the ancient Near Eastern scholarship and just the scholarship in general with respect to ancient ways of thinking, ancient customs, how they perceive the world. And obviously I'm wrestling that with actual reality, like the natural world as we know in modern science, because we don't have a superstitious model in the lab. We just do normal science in the lab. And but I, at the same time, again, I notice that these atheists are very lazy, because immediately, if they're thinking of the ancient past, they're thinking, oh, see, ancient people are superstitious, therefore anything they've recorded is unreliable. No, I think all the more take on board what they've written, so that not only can we see scientifically in the natural world, so to speak, what actually happens, but at the same time why they were thinking about that phenomenon in a superstitious way. And then how interesting when you have the Judeo-Christian worldview in mind, superstition gets removed and pure naturalism gets removed, and then you have like a god as the anchor in those two. In other words, if you think about it, if you touch yourself, this is like we're a carbon-based life form, right?
Right.
So the scientists will say this is just nothing but the natural product of supernova events, the periodic table of elements from exploding suns and all that. But I can at the same time look at this and go, but this is a supernatural thing, because I hold to Big Bang and all that. So if you have a prime mover and God behind that, think about it. This should freak you out. The fact that you're existing is a supernatural thing. This is you are lucky. I hate to use the word lucky, but it's like providence or luck. You should have like an existential angst that you do exist, because guess what? You can't, like, if God exists, that means this is a supernatural thing that I'm touching right now, which is me, you, this microphone, everything. So that's basically the Jewish Christian concept of basically Romans 1:20. Like that, when you look at the natural world, you'll be able to then implicitly understand God's invisible attributes. And I like Paul's wording there, invisible attributes, because he's beyond the system. But at the same time, when I look at this, I can actually sort of peel the curtain, and just by looking at reality, I can just be like, yeah, this is pretty amazing stuff. And then on top of that, the debt solutions part of it. So that's how that's where I was coming from with respect to Canadian atheists. But these folks, obviously, I don't want to judge their journey, and I don't know where they stand in their journey, but it seems that they come from either an unfortunate mix of emotional baggage, and hence it's like that's like their brick wall. And so if you offer anything valid, they immediately will put more walls in front of that, because they may be afraid to not afraid to acknowledge it, but because I presume they've been lied to so much, or they've been treated badly so much that, or maybe they genuinely have a bias against it. I don't know, but it could be one of those parameters. And so then, they just they don't want to hear it. But I started to notice that he was starting to hear us out. That's something I was noticing with him in our discussion. So yeah, in regards to Joshua 10, I take it literally, but it's that nuance with the scholarship that I don't literally think the sun was stopping. I actually find it interesting that the text goes into a little bit of a poetic prose to speak about the ancient Near Eastern deities of the region, and that to me not only aligns scientifically with just the natural laws, but how God and His sovereignty is theologically saying, yeah, I'm above Shamesh, the sun god, or the moon god, in those valleys. That's where I was coming from with that. So
yeah, and so to give you a little bit of by the way, Slam RN is in the live chat asking if you might
she's a good
comment.
friend.
Yeah. Oh, cool. That is cool. She's wondering if you might comment so they might be able to tag you. If you want to do something like that. I don't know if you want to live chat or not.
Let me see.
But so to give you a sort of an idea of kind of where I'm coming from it, because that is I think that's a good place to start as to why we come to the presuppositions that we do, right? Or come to things the way that we do, I guess is a better way of putting it. So I was well, first off, let me just say I have been into philosophy, history, politics, and religion as young as I could possibly imagine. And I have been actively involved in philosophy, meaning doing what I would consider is the work of a philosopher, since I was 12 years old. Now I don't need to phrase exactly what it means so that everybody knows. I'm not trying to throw upon myself the titles of like people like Aristotle or Immanuel Kant or anything like that. I don't think I'm like them.
Right.
But what I mean is that since I was in middle school, I would think about things and write them down and continue to, examine them and re-examine them and then re-examine them and then find somebody else's opinions and re-examine them now that I had the context of those opinions, and just doing the things that a philosopher does, right? Whether you want to call me one or not, I guess, is up to everybody's interpretation in that, or whether or not I'm a good one, of course, is up to everybody's interpretation. But so that was always half of my background. And then the other half of my background was that my father was incredibly fundamentalist, but I could care less, right? And I just kind of eventually, not even could I care less, but I was sort of a little bit even hostile to the notion. I found notions like Buddhism or religions, I should say, like Buddhism, to be much more palatable, because I started to basically believe, on the basis of what I thought was philosophical truth, that things like order are sort of illusory, but things like suffering are definitely not, right? And I thought that Buddhism had a good understanding of that. I thought that the Cynics in Greek philosophy had a good understanding of that, of how like the inevitable monotony of nihilism, basically, as I like to put it. And so I started to really adopt a lot of those positions. And due to the fact that they make a lot of non-religious claims, I do still appreciate the Cynics quite a bit. In fact, I call myself the Cynicague, right? Because Antisthenes is probably my favorite to this day non-Christian philosopher. Although I'll be honest, Schopenhauer gives him the run for his money, but nonetheless, I was coming at it from that position, and then eventually I got into things like just doing hood rat stuff, right? Hoodlum stuff. Eventually got caught, went to juvie, started to study Moses. And I ended up being in and out of juvie for roughly 6 months at a time. So I only spent like 3.5 months in juvenile hall, but it was over a 6-month period. And during that time, you're there, you just do a lot of reading. And so the lot of reading I would do is typically about, would be the Torah, actually. Just because I was really fascinated with the idea of Moses. I thought he had a really interesting story, right?
Yeah.
And I started to get the opinion that Jesus, or not, excuse me, not Jesus, Moses was this unbelievable ethicist. And it was like mind-boggling to me. Like, why is this not philosophy 101? Like, people talk about ethics. They talk about Kant. They might talk about Solon. They might talk about common law. They might talk about stuff, just, there's so much you can talk about. Moses is never brought up, but I thought his Mosaic law was so perfect in its understanding of human nature. And in its showing what sin actually was and what the penalties for sin actually was. And then eventually I started looking at Jesus and saw the same thing. And I started to actually piece together in my mind, Jesus knows Moses's law so well. It's almost like he knew him. Like they knew each other personally. And like Jesus is the same way Plato could extrapolate from Aristotle's law, or excuse me, from Socrates' law. And from his teachings, right? Because teaching would be a better word. He doesn't have a law. But nonetheless, it was almost like Jesus had that kind of relationship, that personal relationship with Moses. And one day I just sort of had the idea, well, Moses knew God face to face. Maybe if Jesus is God, he actually did know Moses. And this 1,400 years that separates them doesn't actually, in effect, separate them. And in other words, maybe this thing I'm noticing is not a coincidence. And so I started to get a very intellectual understanding of God, meaning that I believed he was there, and I believed that he was the God of the Bible. And I also believed that he was even the God of ethics and things like that, and that he had the best ethical systems. But there wasn't really like that relationship aspect. It was sort of just there. And then I had a instance where I was actually reading the Left Behind books, and the Left Behind books, they're great, but I'm nothing about them in particular. It just happened to be the thing that was the catalyst for this, right? And there's a scene in one of them where people start lining up to be beheaded for the Christian faith, and they're all singing Amazing Grace as they do so. Which Amazing Grace has always been a heartstring puller for me. So reading that, plus being in juvie, plus having this recent new religious thing, plus hearing the song was like, it was the whole thing. And I sort of had a little bit of an emotional moment, and an emotional moment then turned into a deeply and intensely religious moment that I could only describe as having a genuine encounter with the Holy Spirit. And of course, not in any way that's like prophetic, but in the same way that all Christians do, right? That is what I mean there. And so
I'll just quickly say that was a moment I had 5 years and later. So in other words, I had a theoretical belief in 3 or 4 years into my journey. But after all that intellectual endeavor, the Matthew 11 moment, like, take my yoke is easy, burden is light, you'll find rest in me. But I read that like 10 times already, and then it hits you, right? And then you're just like, all right, I'm buying the knees now. Like, yeah,
right,
yeah,
I hear that for sure. And what ended up happening after that, is because I was already so interested in philosophy beforehand. I started to really, start to ground, I think, the philosophical questions first, even to the expense of theological ones. So it's like to where I was a Christian for maybe 3-4 years before I finally started actually paying attention to theology, which was a problem, right? And so I came to some conclusions that have been lenses I have seen through ever since. One of which is I have a firm philosophical belief that fundamentalism is the most consistent form of religious expression, and regardless necessarily of the religion. So to give sort of an example, even that's outside of Christianity, if I were a Jew, like religiously speaking, not ethnically, obviously, I could only, in the way that I think, be Orthodox or Karaite. I could never be Reform. I could never be conservative. I could never be any of those other side ones, unless, of course, I was convinced of the Messiah. I might be able to be Messianic. But the point being that because I just have this deep conviction that the most strict adherence to this philosophy is the correct adherence to this philosophy. And that's a little bit influenced from the things that I have from, my religious background, and also the Cynics are very big on strict adherence to the philosophy, and that was, of course, my philosophical background with cynicism. So there's influences there for sure, but that was sort of the position that not only in that conversation, but in my whole apologetics ministry that I have kind of come with is I don't look at the term fundamentalist as a bad thing. I own it, and I think even that it's a title I wear with pride. And I aim to show people that it is not only consistent to be a fundamentalist, but that the positions are not absurd, but that there is actually good scriptural evidence, good philosophical evidence, good historical evidence. And I do word that very specifically, by the way. When I say the only consistent form, I used to say the only legitimate form until I realized that, I was effectively casting out a bunch of people as non-Christians. And so now I use the word consistent to be a little bit less loaded. In other words, just because somebody's not a fundamentalist, I don't think that necessarily means they're not a Christian, right? That would be, I think that's going too far, but that's what, so I word it in that way as I think my little maxim, if you will. And that was sort of the position that I was coming from in our conversation, why I would take a more, what you might say, I guess, is surface level, in a way, interpretation.
Yeah, now that you've sort of like explained that, I don't think I would disagree. I would, in fact, mine would be, I think maybe it's just a semantic issue. Because I wouldn't use the word fundamental if I was to describe my method, but at the same time, I can see what you're saying, and I don't have a problem with that. Like, I think with me, because of my training in my education and just, what I do on my channel and how I've produced content, again, under the label of apologetics, what my method is, I don't want to assert things if I don't have the data. So in other words, I'm happy to say I don't know, or look, there's a bit of fuzzy data here. Maybe it'll be clearer in the future. But I think, so that's where I wouldn't use the word fundamental. But where I think I would agree with you with fundamental would be something like, say, the Nicene Creed, or the pre-Pauline Creed in 1 Corinthians 15. Obviously that's fundamental. Like, what's there to debate about? So that's I would agree with you on that. Like, I think we spoke past each other in that sense, and
and it is interesting, how that stuff does tend to, I guess, happen a lot of times when tempers get flared, for sure. But so to get in some specifics, of course, not that we want sparks for sure, but we do, just to see if we might be able to potentially get some certain things hammered out. So it is my understanding from what I took away from the SJ conversation, and if this is incorrect, by all means, correct it. It was my understanding that, for example, to use the walls collapsing in Jericho, that you did not feel that miracle literally happened, but that it was a naturalistic thing, like potentially an earthquake or something along those lines. Was that an accurate representation of your view? And also, would you like to extrapolate on that at all?
Yeah, so you see, I want to take the Bible consistently. So if I'm coming across those things in the story, I already have in mind what's flowing in my mind. Is passages like Jeremiah 31 and Jeremiah 33. This is like 31 verse 35, around them, where God himself makes a very interesting, like, those are examples where God himself makes a very interesting covenant as an analogy about his other covenants. So obviously the main covenant he's made is with Israel. Jesus comes through that. And then it's just interesting. It's like, why would he put that in there? But he's putting it in there anyway. And I can see why, because he's disengaging from the polytheistic religions surrounding Israel, because the polytheistic religions in themselves are arbitrary. They're, like how, the Bible says God's not the author of confusion, but the other gods if you have a polytheistic system, it's just confusion. And
Mhm.
also those other gods are associated with certain natural phenomena. So in Jeremiah 31, God's like, look, so you know that I'm going to be a consistent, non-arbitrary, non-confusing, like I'll keep my word. Notice that the regulation of the laws of nature, like Ecclesiastes, the sun rises, sun sets, nothing new under the sun. It's just it's a uniformitarian cycle.
Right.
The reason why it's uniform and the reason why it's proper, intelligible, consistent. It's not like something random just suddenly, like some arbitrary things happening now. Like it's a consistent thing. And he says, I've made a covenant with the laws that govern the sun, moon, and stars. And then he literally says, if these laws cease to function, then I might as well just give up my plans for Israel. And that's a very interesting promise. So just as right now I could go into the lab and do some physics experiment, as a Christian now, I'm like, my hair raises on end, because I'm realizing, hang on a second, the laws are still working, because I know in my Bible that God's maintaining a covenant with the laws of nature, because guess what? He's the creator. And Hebrews 1 verse 2, he upholds the universe with his word.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's like, so if I'm having, so notice the Bible is very consistent in that sense. Like Hebrews 1 is New Testament, Jeremiah is Old Testament. Obviously, Joshua and Judges are Old Testament. So so when I'm reading these passages, and obviously in our debate with the flood and so on, I'm having to then, so in this case, I'm being fundamental, or I'm being a fundamentalist and saying it's the same God throughout all the scripture.
Right.
And it's not like he's suddenly introduced this covenant in Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is obviously past Joshua. No,
Mm-hmm.
he's the same God from Genesis 1:1 all the way through. So when we come down to this thing known as miracles, I tend to like to think about it as what's called a hypernatural event rather than a supernatural event. And this is what I mean. Terms like monotheism, polytheism, supernatural, natural, these are actually all words that were coined not even the last like 500 years. No, like if you go to if you go to Paul in the first century and you're like, hey, the resurrection, that was a supernatural event. Paul, as a Second Temple Jew, he'll be like, what are you talking about? Or Paul, are you a monotheist? And Paul will be like, what are you talking about? But if you explain it, then he'll understand. So I find it interesting that the Jewish scriptures show, like again, John 1:1, in the beginning is a logos, a rational prime mover, logos, principle, right? The word. They had no dichotomy or like a division, kind of like what the atheists do online, like Pine Creek and all these. They sort of see this God's up there and the natural world's down here. So when God does something, like if God were to interact with reality, then he'll have to do something that contradicts itself. Hence supernatural.
Right.
But notice that subtly. Notice how subtle this is. In other words, it's a subtle satanic attack against God, because the non-Jewish pagan religions only thought in supernatural terms, because guess what? You have what's already natural, and then in this case, in Christian lingo, a demon might come and do something, but it can only do something. So the effect that you see, or the phenomena that you see, is because it is contradicting what's natural to the system. So if God has to do something in his own sovereignty, I like to think God working with his own laws that he himself has created. Because if he comes in and if he's doing some, supernatural event, which is what the demons do, notice then that it sounds like he can't do anything else but do something that contradicts the very laws that he himself has created. Like, why can't he just work with the system that he's already created and manipulate it? but at the same time, he's not contradicting it. So and that's what I think that's happening in, say, the incarnation. So the hypostasis of Logos and the flesh. There's the ultimate example of simultaneous, Logos, and it's not like the Logos is contradicting the biology of Jesus's body. He could bleed, he needed to eat, he slept, and then at the same time, he ruled the cosmos. He could walk on water, he could turn water to wine. So, with respect to the walls of Jericho, I'm not afraid to say it's some form of natural event, but at the same time, it's a hypernatural event because God is doing something simultaneous with the walls collapsing. Now, obviously, with the sun standing still, now you're talking about more cosmic elements going on, and in that sense, if the sun did stand still, even just for a second, God can't suddenly arbitrarily just stop gravity functioning the way it does function. He would have to, in order for life to survive in that brief moment. But so I would suspect God to be doing something else in that story. In this case, attacking the other divine beings of that region, rather than literally seeing it as the sun halting. But yeah, something like Jericho and maybe the flood. So I take the Persian Gulf flood view, the incarnation of Christ, water to wine. Like for example, the water to wine one is a pretty cool one. Like notice that you have all those jars. Notice that the geography of that location is given, where they collect the water from Cana. Notice that, well, this is not in the text, but we know this in archaeology. They would cull out, they would only take a certain amount of water from the jars. In other words, they didn't take all the water from the jar. They'd only take like a quarter or a third of the water from the jar, purely because all that sediment and all that muck would settle down here, and it'd only take the top stuff. Now, here's the hypernatural thing coming into play. Notice that the ingredients are there for the water to turn to wine, because you have all the alcohols, the biochemicals already there in that muck that's down at the bottom, and Jesus just has to manipulate the biochemicals to then generate into wine. Now, I had a scientist friend, who's a Christian, who said, Rob, notice that's all well and cool, but I can make it even simpler, which makes it even more, that God is sovereign. And I actually like his response. He said, look, even if Jesus used distilled water, pure just H2O, all he has to do, he's not splitting the molecules. All you have to do is, from a type of ex nihilo, so we're talking about quarks and gluons, so this is subatomic properties within oxygen and hydrogen. He just has to increase the electron spin around oxygen and hydrogen and so on, and then from that, the not only the elements but the molecules become a lot more complicated and bigger and so on, and then you can develop the alcohols on top of that, and then you develop wine. Like you could literally do that, because Paul says that in Romans 4, God can bring into things that did not exist, but so in like an ex nihilo event, and at the same time not contradict the laws of nature. So yeah, so in other words, when we talk about God supernaturally, I'm starting to hate that term, because it seems to put God in a box, like he can only function in this one way. Hang on a second, this world in itself is a miracle, is, if you want to say supernatural, miracle. So then, and if Hebrews 1 verse 2 and 3 holds true, he doesn't need to do something as if he has no ability to work with what he's already made. It's like, okay, I've just made this thing, now I'm stuck. Now I can't do anything. I need to now introduce something that is contrary to what I've already made in order to then achieve my purpose. Like, why can't he achieve his purpose with what he's made? Kind of like the potter and the clay. Like the Jeremiah 18, the potter can relump and reshape the clay as he sees fit. that's how I see miracles, and yeah. So I don't know how you gauge with that, but
yeah. So there's a couple things I would personally say. So I can see a lot of what you're saying for sure, in that obviously God is fully capable of manipulate, and in fact I would even just put it in a short quip, because I think people have heard it a lot because Frank Turek is famous and it's his quip. There's a difference between contradicting the laws of nature and overpowering the laws of nature, right? For example, if I pick up my phone, I haven't contradicted gravity, I've overpowered gravity. And it's not the same thing. Overpowering it is just simply exerting more power than the force itself, whereas and therefore in some way seemingly getting around it, whereas obviously contradicting it would be rendering it in some way, shape, or form null and void, right? And so I think that's an interesting distinction to make, and it's a true distinction to make even too, because we have times clearly in the Bible where God does use natural means to achieve his goal. And in fact, since we're in Joshua, I think one of the greatest examples there would be the Battle of Ai. The Battle of Ai is brilliant military strategy. It's not miracle, right? There's no walking around Jericho. There's no meteors from heaven. There's no plague or anything like that. What it is it's just a very brilliant military strategy on the part of a brilliant general who is Joshua, but of course a God-appointed general who is Joshua, and of course God-ordained general who is Joshua. And of course that's just one example that could be used there. But just to say that I certainly agree to an extent about some of the stuff you're saying, right? Where I would disagree, I think, is that I believe rather than contradicting the laws of nature that God has set up, what he demonstrates in a miracle is that he has power over them. And so let me give kind of an example, right? So God has set up a system where it is appointed unto man once to die, and after this is the judgment, right? And that's the way that God's system is as far as life is concerned, right? In fact, even though I don't think they're judged afterwards, that's just the way life is for everyone, like the dog and the cat and the squirrel even, right? That's just the way it is. We die, we grow old, the passage of time, et cetera, right? And of course, Ecclesiastes has a lot of poetic and incredibly depressing things to say about that, but things people should hear. Nobody gets scared of the book of Ecclesiastes, especially if you want to get in philosophy. That should be like philosophy 101. But at any rate,
just quickly, for me, when I was coming out of my atheism, Ecclesiastes was my atheist book, definitely. And because notice it doesn't give any answers. It just says this is the way things are, and it does end the book by saying fear God. But then now what do you do with that, right? So my natural response was, what is the answer? Now it's my theory. Someone else could have a different point of view, but I think the answer to Ecclesiastes is Ephesians. So read those two books in conjunction. In other words, read Ecclesiastes as part 1, and then part 2 is Ephesians, and that to me was the answer. Yeah, they both start with an E, right? So yeah.
Well, and it is I think a big portion of the answer too. Not that I want to contradict that, because I think people should do that for sure. I'm gonna actually try that myself. But also, for me, I think one of the big answers too was Jesus himself.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. In that it was like almost and so I'm getting actually a little ahead of myself, because that actually gets me to a point that I was making. Right. So now Jesus resurrects from the dead, right? Which is on its face a violation of the system God has set up, and potentially even worse if we're talking about naturalism. Although not that I'm saying you're a naturalist, but just to say if we're talking naturalistically, would be the taking of Enoch or Elijah, right? Because they actually don't die if the text is understood literally. And Enoch, I think, is even stronger than Elijah, because one might be able to make a metaphorical argument around Elijah. I don't think you could, but one might be able to. Whereas with Enoch, the language is pretty pointed, right? Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. The word actually that's used, it's most literal translated, is God transliterated him, interestingly enough. You know what I mean? And I think that obviously seems like a contradiction, almost shrugging off, if you will, of the laws of nature. But in reality, what we're seeing isn't so much contradicting the laws of nature as much as God is saying, I am the ultimate arbiter of these laws. And in certain places, I can decide whether or not they will see fit here. In other words, it's like the overpowering analogy that Frank Turek gives, but to a much more extreme example, right? You could almost compare it to the famous parenting trope that I don't know if any parent has actually given, but everybody knows it anyways, which is, where were you when we were paying for the house? Where were you when we were walking to school up and down both ways? You know what I mean? All that kind of stuff. It's like the idea just kind of being like, no, I, the parent, am the ultimate arbiter of what's going down within this home. It's not necessarily that I'm contradicting my rules. It's not necessarily that there is no explanation behind my rules, whatever the reason you're talking to the kid is, right? But what it is that I'm the parent. I do have the right to do this, right? And in a much greater scale, I think that's what God does with miracles. And so when I look at Jericho, it's interesting. Jericho, from a military perspective, you do have to take it out because it's from Kadesh Barnea. It's the first major city-state you're going to actually hit. So it's inevitable in that sense. But in a way, it's kind of easy pickings, right? The Bible doesn't actually explicitly say this. And of course, we all know it has its famous walls, which were almost impenetrable, very difficult to attack. But the reason Jericho had those walls in the first place is because at max, they might have been able to get 500 soldiers on the wall. It was a very small city-state. You could even almost refer to it as a village. If you live in any town whatsoever, not city even necessarily, you probably live in a town that's bigger than Jericho, right? And yet God decides this is a place where I am going to actually, do something that is such a big deal that Rob and CJ are going to discuss it 3,500 years later. You know what I mean? Or 3,400, I guess is more accurate.
Right.
And why? Well, because it has these magnificent walls, and I being Jehovah, am about to show, right, that I have the power over, in this case, these walls. Your walls are great, but they're not so great that I cannot personally overpower them. And I think even if we were to have an instance of like maybe a naturalistic explanation, like say, for example, an earthquake did knock down the walls of Jericho, which I guess I'm not 100% opposed to per se, honestly. It wouldn't explain necessarily like so many other miraculous parts of it that I still would have to, maybe I won't use the word supernatural, but almost use metanatural. You know what I mean? It still almost appears to be like a greater than natural, and even hypernatural. I kind of like that word. It's not a bad word thing, because Joshua isn't, he's not playing guesswork, right? He knows exactly, all right, we're going to walk around. It's going to be 7 days exactly. And on the seventh day, we're going to walk around 7 times, and then we're going to scream. And when we scream, that's when the walls are being knocked down. And it's not going to hurt us. So if it's an earthquake, it's got to be localized enough that it is just Jericho, which is possible, right? That's not something that I think is outside the realm of possibility. But what you end up having there is, in effect, like it's, even if naturalistic, it still ends up being too coincidental to be naturalistic in my view. You know what I mean? And I also think there is that notion of God, rather than contradicting these rules, is more declaring his sovereignty over these rules. And I also think, just to briefly end with this, I think that's why he only does it a couple times, right? It's, there's the miracle at the Jordan River, and then there's the miracle at Jericho, and then he does help at the Battle of the Ajalon Valley with the sun and the moon standing still. And I believe that's also the one where there was a meteor shower. I believe it's the same event, if I'm not mistaken. But outside of that, meaning 29 separate cities plus one more battle, it appears Joshua does on his own, right? And of course, that's God's appointed general and God's appointed army. But the point being that the majority of that conquest was natural, right? It was an army conquering another people. But in the instances where God decided he was going to show his power were him showing clear, I think, power not only over the false gods, but over nature itself, and saying, that I'm not necessarily suspending these rules per se, as much as I'm showing you I set them up, and I can set them up in any which way that I see fit. Does that make sense?
I think that keyword there is suspension of the natural laws. I think that's the best way to put it, because I mean, that's you nailed it. Like, God, if he has to suspend the natural laws in order to achieve some miracle in place, so in other words, he's suspending natural laws. Now I need to introduce some weird magic thing. Now that the magic thing finishes, okay, now the natural laws can resume. Like, to me, that doesn't show true sovereignty. Can he achieve something while the laws are still in operation? And in my opinion, that requires a God that's truly omniscient, because not only is he outside the system, but he knows exactly the integral workings of that system in order to then, at any given moment, even down to the quantum level, to achieve what he needs to do. So, by the way, that's my neighbor's fire alarm. I hope that's not affecting anything. So.
Yeah, no, it's we're good. I was actually just about to ask if you could hear that. It's just this apartment is terrible. So anytime we decide to cook anything that's got meat in it, the fire alarm goes off. So in Australia we have, so it's in the middle of the day, so someone's probably having a barbecue running, and there you go. So yeah.
By the way, I'll also just quickly say this: when you look at, if you have a map, so this is from a commentary on Joshua 10. You can actually trace out the distances, the goings back and forth of where they had to go during this battle, and I can share with you the graphic on Messenger in a moment. But this in itself shows that at a minimum, the whole battle took 2 weeks. So even that notion of it being either 12 hours or 24 hours, that the sun's halting and standing still until the battle finished, that can't work with respect to the mileage, because you're talking at least 50 miles that they're having to travel to and fro in order to then defeat all the enemies. And critical scholars, and so this is the point, like, those who have an agenda to disparage the Bible will be like, oh, see, you mean to tell me the battle only was fought for 1 day, but look at the distances involved. How could you fit 50 miles in 1 day? But then you see, they're the ones they have an agenda. But the ones who are evangelical will point out, like J. Glenn Taylor, for example, that it's Yahweh versus the gods, and if you read it very carefully, it's the sun in Ajalon to stand still, and the moon in that location to stand still, and these are the deities of that region. So in this story, God is subjugating the gods of those regions to show his sovereignty, but using the names of the natural objects because they are associated with that. But yeah, what would be natural is the hailstones that are coming down, and also I think either in Judges 5 or Joshua 5, one of the two, could be Judges, but it mentions something like the stars are fighting in the heavens. That language. So yeah, you could take that celestially, or again, stars in this sense could be divine beings. So,
well, and so there would be a couple things, I think, because so now this is one of my, I guess, more I don't know. I don't want to oversell it, but I'm a big fan of military history, I guess is my point. So I could call it a strong suit if I may.
I'll give you that map right now, by the way, on Messenger.
Yeah,
So if
absolutely.
you want to share on your live stream, go for it. Yeah.
That would actually probably be a good idea. I'll go ahead and pull that up right now so we can get that going for sure. So out of curiosity, are you familiar with it's a American war, so if not, certainly no problem there. But are you familiar with any of the campaigns of the American Civil War?
Oh no, I'm as far as American history goes, no. Well, no. I mean, I'd like to think so, but yeah, no.
Yeah, I don't know much about Australian history, so I'm not going to hold anything against you.
Sure.
But so there's a campaign, very interesting campaign in the United States Civil War known as the Shenandoah Valley Campaign, or other people will call it Jackson's Valley Campaign. It's a Confederate campaign from the Stonewall Brigade, which was led by a general known as Thomas Jackson, whose name in history would be Stonewall Jackson. So if you had ever heard of him, that would be the more likely name to have heard him by, as his nickname Stonewall. And this was his first major campaign of the Civil War. He had other battles that he had done exceptionally well in, but they were just individual battles. This was the first real major campaign where he was leading the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And the Shenandoah Valley is this really dense forest, sometimes even swampy region, right? That's really difficult to get through. And Jackson was a leader of the Confederate Army, which was very, being the rebel army, of course, the ones who were seceding, right? They were underfunded, basically. So he didn't have a lot of horses. He didn't have a lot of cavalry in general outside of his infantry, because obviously when I talk about him not having horses, what I mean is within his infantry, right? His officers and stuff like that. But also the cavalry themselves, not very much. He doesn't have a lot of wagons. A lot of things going against him, right? And the Union sent three. Now I know I'm going into a deep thing with this, but you'll see the relevance, I promise. The Union sends this massive army in a 3-pronged attack into Virginia, into the Shenandoah Valley, to try and basically just occupy the region. They're not so interested in getting rid of Jackson per se, as much as Jackson is interested in getting rid of them. But they just want to occupy the region so he can't do anything, really. He can't present any level of threat to the Union troops, especially as they try to get down towards Richmond and end the war, right? Because Richmond is the Confederate capital. Now, Jackson, if you actually do all of the math for where he had to go, because these armies, these Union armies were in 3 different areas in the Shenandoah Valley, right? Jackson was having his troops marching on average, which means there are days that it actually ended up exceeding this, and by even a lot, on average 20 miles a day through the Shenandoah Valley while actively fighting battles in the fight. And he actually managed to defeat all 3 armies in such a way to where there would be times when he would attack one army before that army had even actually gotten a message that it's the army to its side had been attacked, to its flank rather is the more accurate term, had been attacked, right? And in the second notion, or in the second army that he attacked, after having already attacked one. So sorry, that's a bad thing to say. The third one that he attacked, but the second one that would have opportunity to be notified of it, right? Because the first one's obviously a surprise. They actually they initially thought it couldn't actually be him, because they thought there was no way that anybody could get from the battlefield he was just at to the battlefield it seemed like he was attacking. And it got actually to a point where Union soldiers started to have myths surrounding Stonewall Jackson, right? Where he was they were the foot cavalry, and they were kind of like phantoms almost, and they came out of nowhere, and they came out of the night and all this kind of stuff. And Stonewall was like this grim reaper and all that kind of stuff, right? because it just didn't make any sense to anybody how this dude could get this army to all these different places in such a short period of time and fight battles and win, and then immediately leave to go do it again, right? And my point in saying all that is simply to say that what that provides for me, since that's something that's a much more verifiable, right? 1862 is a very short period of time ago. That provides for me evidence that, militarily speaking, it does appear that some pretty extreme things are possible. Now, I would be willing to grant, just for the record, because I think like it's something like 18 or 23 miles that it would take to get from Gilgal to Gibeon in the initial day. And then, of course, there's the chase everywhere else, right? That's a fun fact I always remembered from, I think Richard Gabriel is his name, if you know who he is. Did a lot of work with the History Channel, but at any rate, I would be willing to accept that perhaps the entire Ajalon Valley campaign took longer than a single day. But what it appears to me, at least, is at least that first initial day, the day where it seems that the miracle is taking place, was a single event. Kind of, in other words, it seems like the way that this campaign goes is there's a massive battle that Joshua wins, and then over the next week or so, he appears to be going and picking off the remnants of this battle that have dispersed elsewhere. You know what I'm saying? And I think if you had that actually happening, that would end up being, in my opinion, more consistent with what the text is presenting. And the reason I say that is because when Joshua, the book, I mean, not necessarily the person, talks about the elongated day, it uses a interesting phrase. So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day, right? And it does seem, in my opinion, to be talking specifically about, even if the Ajalon Valley campaign extends a little farther, that specifically this one miracle, and therefore this initial battle, might actually be a single day event. Now, I don't think necessarily that God just outright suspends absolutely all of the laws of nature to elongate a day. I'm sure God set up the universe in such a way that there is a more sufficient answer than that, right? We see pretty awesome, what's the word there? Cosmological phenomenon. Cosmological is the word I was looking for, right? That would suggest that it's certainly possible that something happened where it might have just appeared, right? I mean, just look at Alaska as a perfect example, right? Alaska will have times where they have like a month where it's dusk the entire month. And with like fluctuations there. So I'm not necessarily opposed to a naturalistic argument per se. But I do think at bare minimum, it does appear this is a elongated day. And it's interesting. I guess I don't know this verse in Hebrew. But I would suspect that's probably the term kol yom, for whole day. I could be wrong about that. But kol would be all.
Like all day. Yeah.
And so that would be sort of, I guess, my thoughts on the point there. And I would also point out too, I do believe Joshua 10 does also have the asteroid event as well, which might even be a way to explain how this is possible, right? That it seems to be, those are two different meteorological events that perhaps are even related to each other. But I guess, yeah, that would be sort of my response there. If you want to comment.
Well, I'm about to send you again through Messenger a couple of papers that actually showcase, and this is as recent as 2017 actually. This was published in, for example, Nature journal articles, Astrophysical Journal. So this is your so-called secular journal publications. where and how ironic, the earliest description of a possible solar eclipse event that's recorded happens to be biblical. And in this case, Colin Humphreys and a few others from 2017, they've been working on this for about a decade, and then they published their findings, and I'll give you the papers, where if the event itself, so in other words, I have other papers from the ancient Near Eastern biblical scholars that will say this is a polemic to the deities. So it's not literally the sun stopping and so on, but this is the deities of the region, right? Okay, that's all well and good.
Right. By the way, just so the audience knows,
yep.
I do have the map on the screen just so you guys can see it.
Yep. So that's the back and forth. Like the red arrow will show the initial engagement, and then the different colored arrows is the later engagements. But apparently, all day, all of that takes place. You see, that's the tension that the critical scholars and the evangelicals have with respect to that. So if I see day there as being a period of time, which there are Christians that hold to that view, then it's literally saying all throughout the period of time, God is sovereign. He doesn't have to be sovereign just those 24 hours. He can be sovereign that whole period of time. Now, the Christian scientists like Colin Humphreys will say, but hang on a second, let's, just for the sake of argument, because you do have the hailstones coming down and a few other these meteorological, I mean, guess what? It does give the sense that maybe there's an extended period of light, maybe. There are some Hebrew scholars like Walter Kaiser and Gleason Archer that will say that actually, if you read the Hebrew grammar in a different way, it doesn't mean extended light. Rather, it's saying extended darkness. It's when I first came across that theory, I'm wondering, hang on a second, are they being a little bit sloppy with the Hebrew there? But no, but apparently that's a legit argument. You could sort of see it as a negative. In other words, it's sort of like blinding, or not literally blinding, but putting a little bit of a dark shadow on the region. But from the Israelites' perspective, they're not being affected by it because God is the reason why they're not being affected by it. So based on that Hebrew grammatical observation, Colin Humphreys and a few others were like, hang on a second, so is there a possibility that because you have, notice the sun is associated, the sun is Shemesh. Shemesh is that sun deity that the pagans were worshipping. And if God is the one that's sort of covering Shemesh because of that darkness that could be lurking around, and in this sense, it's also lasting the whole day. Is it possible that a solar eclipse took place? And because notice again, in science, we know what a solar eclipse is. It's the sun, there's the moon. Notice in the passage, you also have sun and moon tensions going on. So you have both the sun and the moon in a solar eclipse. And then on top of, so these are the natural objects in the sky. And then as we know, and also as Christians, God is the creator of these two natural objects. So God's the one like putting them together, basically. So Colin Humphreys is like, I'm just throwing this out there, but if we align the genealogies, and if we align the chronology of the events that lead up to that period in order to then have a rough date estimate of that period, is it possible that we can basically see that, yeah, there must have been a solar eclipse that was then theologically utilized to make a polemical point? And in 2017, they published that paper. And what's interesting is that was an excellent sort of like discovery, because it calibrated basically solar system dynamics a little bit more. And how ironic, it's the biblical text that's helping us do that. Because this, so in other words, this was a historical event. Imagine if this event wasn't historical, like the story was just fiction, and then they just made up this thing, right? But it happened to be true.
Right.
Yeah, I'll send you those papers right now. So yeah.
So I am interested though. So what would you say about the example I give of the Shenandoah Valley campaign, and just like how it may be possible potentially to.
Yeah, I mean that sounds really interesting, but at the same time, I'm thinking of that event. Was that in the 1800s, 1700s?
Yeah, 1862.
Right. And I'm suspecting the geography of the region is vastly different. The logistics are vastly different. Because this is at the end of the day ancient warfare rhetoric and also ancient warfare logistics. We're talking like 2,000-3,000 year difference between the two. And on top of that, we can actually see, and this is one of the. In fact, you can get in onto this with your guest David Rowe when it comes on. But the logistics of that Sinai wilderness wandering, with respect to how they would basically travel, they don't. That's the thing. They don't. That amount of mileage. They don't even travel 3 or 4 hours in a day, like nonstop. They don't do that. They do take their time. In a Semitic culture, they're not just like it's a fixed. I mean, the Roman Empire. This is why the Roman Empire, or even Alexander the Great, this is why they were so good at what they did and the way they could expand, because they had that concept of constantly on the move. Now, if it was constantly on the move, then I suppose you could maybe fit it in 48 hours, but like, I mean, think about it. That's a lot to get done. So I'm appealing more to, or I find it more fascinating if I allow the ancient Near Eastern scholars to be because they specialize in this stuff. So they're showing me a piece of data, and at the same time, I'm going, you know what? Yeah, if this takes roughly 2 weeks to do, that can fit with that phrase all day. And all the more it shows God's not in a hurry. He's not doing this, like telescoping it in 24 hours. He's sovereign over those 2 weeks, absolutely decimating the pagan gods and showing that, Israel takes over basically. And on top of that, you have the calibration of the solar eclipse and all that other natural phenomena that then gets recorded and then, moving forward. I literally, I just start praising God. Like when I look at all the scholarship like this, I just can't help but go, hallelujah. This is just amazing stuff. Yeah. And here's, by the way, here's the papers. I just I checked my library and I found that there's a couple of recent ones using. So the 2017 one by Humphreys is the original, but you may notice there's 2020, 2021, and 2018. They sort of build up on that piece of work, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'll absolutely be checking that out. I got the Humphreys one downloading right now, and then looks like they're actually just finished, so I'll get the other ones here going. I like that you actually have the PDFs too, because usually people send me the articles of PDFs without realizing that that's never actually the full PDF. You ever have that happen to you? Somebody's like, "Oh yeah, here I found it," and it's like, "Oh, dude, that shows me like the conclusion in the abstract. That's it."
Sure. No, because I'm in the academic institute, so I have basically I use my institute to then log in and then I download the PDF. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I certainly do see, some of the points as incredibly interesting for sure. Things that are certainly worthy of note. One thing I think that is, I think, interesting for me is that it does appear to me that, and of course the Shenandoah Valley campaign is just one that comes to my mind immediately. But it just sort of in general, it does appear to me that there is this notion of possibility, at least, right? And maybe that's a little bit of a I don't know, technicality, right? So like the whole so you're saying there's a chance meme, you know what I mean?
Right.
But you know, to an extent, it's sort of, I guess, what I prefer to fall back on in that sense. Just simply knowing that like a general like a Stonewall, or you even mentioned other ones who were really good at keeping constantly on the move, like Alexander. You know, some military achievements are unbelievable. You know, and you know, the bridge at Tyre with Alexander is an example, and Hannibal going through the Alps is an example, and Sun Tzu, provided that the art of war can be believed, taking on a army that outnumbered him 10-1 by attacking them and invading their land. You know,
exactly,
that it's all very, I guess, just impressive stuff. And so, you know, when I couple the ability of Joshua, who I know is a brilliant military commander, because he's, by the time the conquest has started, commanded what the Bible actually says is roughly 40 years, right? And you know, just to clarify, because I know people don't tend to realize this kind of a detail because it's more of an academic detail, but if you actually pay attention, Moses is not a military commander, at least of Israel. Josephus indicates he might be in Egypt, but he doesn't actually command the armies of Israel. Joshua does. Joshua commands when they're fighting the Amalekites. Joshua commands when they fight the is it the Ammonites? I think it is the Ammonites. And in the Jordan Valley campaign, and in fighting against Og. Yeah. And the one instance Joshua doesn't command is Phinehas goes after the Midianites. But interestingly enough, Samaritan tradition tells us that Joshua was still in command, but Phinehas got what was known as the right of first blood, which is basically you get to the glory goes to you, you do the invading, right? But that Joshua was the commander and Phinehas was an underling, which I think is probably historically accurate, just given the context. So in other words, Joshua does have a lot of experience as a brilliant military commander in the Jordan Valley, Amalek, Midian, and so on, right? By the time he gets to Canaan. And so when I couple that, I think with the all-powerful creator of the universe being on Joshua's side in a way that I don't think he was really on anybody else's side throughout history. I mean, if you think of like the archetypal divine warrior, there's a lot of myths people might think of, but Joshua comes to mind immediately for me, at least. And actually, there's no myth that comes after Joshua either. My first two are actually biblical rather than mythic, and that would be also David would be number 2. But just the idea of the divine warrior or the holy warrior, right, or anything like that. It's like Joshua is almost the archetype of that. And, you know, it seems to me very likely, I think, that certain things could be achieved with, but now granted, still absolutely going to look into these sources that you provided me here, because, you know, it is an interesting thing to note. And I also think, you know, it would have to be at least some distance of time. Obviously, as impressive as Shenandoah was, it wasn't completed in 3 days or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, it was still within some level of reason. So I'm certainly, you know, willing to look at a lot of that stuff.
If you in that column, by the way, I'm sending you some more maps of Joshua's conquest, but for not related to the topic. Rather, I just want to make a point with respect to the conquest itself. But if you open Humphreys' paper and you see the title of it, notice he includes the dating of the pharaohs. So it helps calibrate the dating of the pharaohs, the solar eclipse. So here's a biblical story that helps Egyptian chronology. And that's what's so interesting about this. And this is in astronomical research. It's not some hack job. It's a legit thing. Now, the maps I've given you, this is more of a, in the context of the atheists that say things like, oh, God is some tyrant deity causing genocide. Well, notice you mentioned Og a moment ago. So I just want to throw this out there that Joshua's conquest was I certainly believe this, that you have a very interesting Nephilim problem, and Joshua's the whole logic of Karem or Karam, the holy, the what's sacred to God, sacred in the sense of it's set to God for destruction. That's what the harem command is. Notice that's a very strategic route where you have to go to these locations and cull out the Nephilim bloodline. And so it's interesting how they don't touch any of the other regions. Like, there's plenty of regions to touch. So if it was genuine genocide, it would just go everywhere. But it's interesting how there's a very intelligent, like you're getting at, Joshua being a very intelligent commander, and obviously the angel of the Lord, which is Joshua 5, the commander of the host that's leading them. A very deliberate route where not only when you look in the ancient Near Eastern text, but you also look at those regions in the New Testament. So the unclean spirits that Jesus encounters are the Nephilim spirits that are wandering the same regions that were killed, like say Goliath, for example, in those same regions. And it's interesting, Joshua 11 actually says, once the battle is over, the Nephilim some of them still escaped. And it says some to Gath, some to these other locations. But in other words, they were still. But the Joshua war literally culled the Nephilim population down to just a handful. And when it says some survived into Gath, well, who was at Gath? Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I just wanted to throw that out there. I don't know if you hold the same view, but I take that quite literally.
Well, and I don't take a non-literal view of the Nephilim by any stretch. My reason for defending, I guess, a literal slaughter is more because I have a particular view about God's righteousness, in that I think that when he has things like these floods and these, sending Joshua out to conquer and stuff like that, the reason it's so, brutal, for lack of a better term, is because I think our sin really is kind of deserving of that. And so what I always sort of have defended in the notion of the Canaanite slaughters was the notion that God was putting this nation under judgment, justly so, and that he, speaking of meme culture, there's the meme of the Goofy. I don't know if you've seen this one, and he looks kind of like really poorly drawn and angry, and it says, "I'll do it again."
Right.
And in a way, I think that meme does kind of describe my view on this, which is that, like, God will he will do it again if people act that kind of way, and I think there's evidence in that in history. I mentioned already the American Civil War. Well, brilliant as Stonewall Jackson was, the South was still engaged in abhorrent practices, and they haven't recovered from that to this day, 160 years later, right? Like, it appears, at least from my point of view, that God was very wroth with them, and he beat them down, and that I think that when we look at situations like the Canaanites and the flood and try to minimize them, I wonder if we potentially minimize what could come in the future. Because not just the Confederates, the Roman fall was very divine judgment like, and the fall of the Nazis was very divine judgment like. And one could argue that what's going on in the United States right now sort of has this smell of, it seems like these things are very poetic, to use a less loaded term, right? Like, I often pointed out, and whether anybody likes or dislikes Donald Trump, not the point, just the point that, like, how he was the spitting image of everybody who hated him, and also the spitting image of what everybody his supporters hated. I just thought it was the irony of ironies, right? And it was nothing about his policies or anything like that, but like how like he was the president who celebrities hated, but he's the celebrity apprentice, and the president who billionaires hated, but he's got a net worth of $3 billion, and the one who the Christian and evangelical supported, but he's thrice divorced. And it's like, it was like he was in so many ways this poetry almost in his election. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so when I look at these situations, not to get derailed or anything like that, when I look at these situations like Israel being attacked by the excuse me, sorry, I got a little distracted by it. I noticed Danny in the live chat. When I noticed these things like the slaughter of Canaanites and stuff like that, what it seems like to me is God is showing his wrath at sin and his divine judgment, and it really is as brutal as it says.
Yeah.
And I think justly so, right? Like, I think when you think of the things that humans do to each other, it has to be punished. And that's not to say that God isn't interested in also getting rid of a Nephilim population, because I think he certainly is. It's just to say that I think the reason for the brutality, more than any sort of rhetoric, or more than any sort of conquest, or more than even any sort of culling of a Nephilim population, really is that is what God sees sin as. And don't get me wrong, I don't think we should do anything like that. Joshua got a command straight from God, right? That's not something any other person has gotten, except maybe Saul, I guess, was commanded because Samuel. But I think there is a sort of parable for our own life, in that, these sort of things do befall nations and households and even individuals when they are outside of God's divine will. And so as a result, I tend to be a little bit more defensive of, I guess, the literalistic idea. And I know that makes, that's interesting to people, because essentially what I end up defending is that Joshua committed genocide. And I understand that. I really do. But I think that the context, if you will, I guess, the divine context, as far as this being judgment on this nation, and directly commanded of God, does change it, in my view. And of course, there's no genocidal type situation before or after that's ever been like that, right? That's a command specifically for Joshua. And I guess, like I said, you could also say for Saul.
Yeah, I think to sort of give a so I wouldn't disagree with what you just said, but I know there are atheists out there that immediately will be like a hard drive head that's not working, like, oh no. Immediately they'll, like horse blinders on, they'll just focus on that one thing, genocide, and they'll be like, oh, God's this epic tyrant. And so to sort of add a little bit of context around what you're saying, not contradicting what you're saying, but basically showing the rationale behind that historical event that's taking place.
Right.
What is the logic of Karem? That being set apart for destruction.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, again, going back to more of my testimony, where I noticed the biblical story is actually quite beautiful. You have God starting with a family, Genesis 1 and 2, right, and the Bible ending with God ending with the family. So the marriage supper of the Lamb, the bride coming down to New Jerusalem, all that. And in between those two starting and ending extremes, which are basically the same thing, but the ends of the book, all this in between that's taking place, all this muck, this sadness, basically the big epic. This is why I love the narrative flows of, for example, C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, where they, like, Lord of the Rings is a massive epic. It's this multi-layered epic of exactly what you're seeing in the middle of the biblical story. All the things that's happening in Middle-earth. And so, isn't it interesting that when we watch those movies, you have your main characters, But we never once think about, or even, flash an eyelid at, or, we never once think about the odd trooper at the corner of the screen, of the frame, when you're watching Lord of the Rings, getting either hit by a stone or hit by an arrow or something and dying. Because they're just part of the war that's taking place. We would be horrified, we would be devastated if Frodo died, or if Gandalf died, or, like all the key components of the story. If they were to be affected somehow, then, that would be pretty bad. But it's interesting how we don't really budge when some insignificant character off screen just goes and dies. And that's exactly the sort of thing in warfare, that even in this narrative as well. So then, that being said, I find it interesting that God, he starts with the family. Then obviously the famous rebellion thing. All Christians know about this, even atheists. The Genesis 3 rebellion takes place.
Right.
But I found it interesting that the more I looked into the scholarship and most of the Second Temple context that leads into why Jesus was doing what he's doing, there's actually two more falls that build upon Genesis 3. So you have Genesis 3, the fall, then you have God working with that scenario, so like Cain, and God warning Cain, look, sin is creeping at your door, don't do this, don't do that. Sure enough, murder takes place. God's not to blame for that, Cain is. Interestingly, a little bit of a side tangent note here. In the Second Temple literature, which then leads into the Talmudic literature, which then the Quran plagiarizes this, by the way. So in the Quran, it says, in Surah 5, it says, if you save one man, it's like as if you saved all of humanity. And if you've killed one man, it's like you've killed all of humanity. Well, that's a plagiarized ethic from the Talmud, which then the Talmud is deriving it from the Second Temple literature, and the Second Temple literature are deriving it from Genesis 4. Because when God tells Cain, the blood of your brother cries out of the ground, in the Hebrew, it literally says bloods plural. And notice the ethic behind this. So Cain goes and does this horrible thing, and then a lesson develops out of the story for you and me as the reader. If you're fluent in Hebrew, you'll notice this. The bloods of your brother cries out, and then the ethic that's drawn out of that notice, not only have you killed your brother, but you've killed his whole progeny, his whole family line. And so then the implication, if you save a person, it's like you saved his whole family line. So then you have polygamy appearing in Genesis 4. So Cain's lineage, they start to have multiple wives and all that. So then God's working with that. Then Genesis 6 takes place. Now you have a divine rebellion, the sons of God, the Nephilim. In verse 5, at this time, God's grieving. Human evil, corruption to the nth degree, and God's just like, what the heck is going on here? Then the flood takes place, and I believe that was a providential Persian Gulf flooding in response to what's happening in that Persian Gulf local event, because the ark lands just north of the Persian Gulf. Then God again working with the humans, his images. And interestingly, Genesis 9, again, the stipulations. If you kill a man, it's like you've killed me, because people image me. The Table of Nations, Genesis 10. Then Genesis 11, a third rebellion. Tower of Babel, they're wanting to incarnate into God through this tower-like stuff. The ziggurat. So when God then distributes them to the nations, so Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 is a summary statement of Genesis 11. Notice that Deuteronomy 32:8 ends by saying he separates the human race under the number of the other gods, or the other sons of God, but in the Hebrew it's B'nai El, so the other gods. So in other words, all the fallen gods that God casts out. Satan is part of that. Okay, you're now under their subjugation. And then Genesis 12 is where God starts fresh. So Deuteronomy 32 verse 9 is basically Genesis 12, where it says God's allotted portion is Jacob. So Abraham, Genesis 12, Abraham, Isaac, and then Jacob. Then when you get into the Exodus narrative, now it's God versus the gods. And then from Exodus, when you go into Joshua and Judges, it's still God versus the gods. And you see, this is how I found the logic of Karem and those wars. So obviously at the horizontal level, we have human tensions and politics and all that takes place. But the atheist or the atheist critic that doesn't have the perspective of the vertical tension or the vertical context of the cosmic tensions of God and the gods as part of that whole discussion. So basically, Job is an example of this. You have Job in his local human context and Job and his human friends having a discussion, what's going on. But at the same time, you have the overarching, and as a reader, you can actually see this. There's a whole overarching divine discussion that's part of that story. And it's the same thing in the Old Testament. And so then finally, when you reach the New Testament, notice how Satan, when he's tempting Jesus in the wilderness, I'll give you all these nations. The nations that your prophets like Isaiah were speaking about how, Israel will be a light to the nations so the nations can come back. Because guess what? They've been allotted to these other gods. What does that mean? Satan is in control of them. So if you bow down to me, I'll give you all these nations. And Jesus doesn't bow down to Satan. But Acts 2, literally every nation listed in Acts 2 at Pentecost is the table of nations in Genesis 10. Just by happenstance, because it's Pentecost, Jews from those locales come and worship. They then happen to see Peter give his sermon. 3,000 are saved. And then like a virus, they go back into the nations, and then infiltration. The gospel infiltrates, and then the reclaiming of the nations come back. And then Satan lost the fight at the resurrection, at the cross and the resurrection. So he's already lost 40 days prior to Pentecost. But you see that now I've given like in what you just said a moment ago, I'm sort of giving a larger sort of like circular context around what you just said to any atheists that might be listening to this, that's technically the biblical story. And the whole book of Hebrews is all about God having to deprogram ancient humans in the ancient Near East. So a moment ago, when you're talking about the law and how beautiful the law is and so on with Moses, I agree with you on that. But at the same time, I would say that's still under the context of human stipulations that God accommodates, because at the end of the day, they're still derived from an ancient Near Eastern perspective. And then the Sermon on the Mount is basically Jesus basically going, you've heard it say this way or read this way, but I tell you. And he completely starts clean and fresh with a more of a divine sort of perfection. And Hebrews 8 gets at that. Like, Jesus has provided better promises, quotes Jeremiah 31, a new covenant. So I see. So my testimony is based on the question I asked at my Opa. Opa is German for grandfather. So at my Opa's funeral, what's the most efficient and sufficient means God can solve death? When I ventured into philosophical discussions, I came across this German word called Chaoskampf, or struggle. So struggle with chaos. So Romans 8, the corrupting bondage of this universe. And I couldn't help but go, oh my gosh. Not only is this the best of all possible worlds, Leibniz, but if we have the hypostasis of God, so the Logos, in hypostasis with the terrestrial nature that is Chaoskampf, theosis is possible. Theosis is that first century Greek term to mean glorification, or divinization up, and we become adopted as the children of God. And then notice that picture just shows how petty human history has been. All the misunderstandings, the wars, just the chaos comf of the system. Hence, the end of First Corinthians 15. Death is swallowed up in life, in victory. Where is your victory to the grave? Where is your sting to the death? And it's interesting. Death is Thanatos in Greek.
Yeah.
So when I was watching, the Marvel, like when you see Thanos in the Marvel version, you start to really hate the guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's, to use that as a polemic, if you're going to share the gospel with anyone, and I've done this before, I was like, did you really like Thanos? And it's like, no. Well, guess what? It's the same word used, and and that's the point. It's like you're meant to. It's not natural. Death is not a natural thing, and just as Thanos was swallowed up, just with that simple click of the finger that Tony Stark did, he sacrificed himself, and there's your Jesus imagery there. He took it upon himself to just cull away Thanos, and just as Thanos just wipes away, death is swallowed up. So the new creation, just that, you see, it solves so many issues. It solved not only Myopa's death, but it solved just the deaths in general. And I don't know why atheists get so fixated on, it's like they're stuck, like a hard drive head that's just stuck on that one thing in the middle of the Bible, which is like, say, Joshua's wars. And they don't realize there's a whole thing that leads to that. And then there's a whole bunch more that then leads to, the Jesus story, and then the new creation. Yeah.
Well, and I, I do. I see, a lot of the point there. Of course, I do think the primary reason that people struggle with that isn't so much that it happened. Like, in other words, like it's not so much that they have a problem with the genocides, I guess, to say another word, or to use that word per se. As much as it is that people they don't like the righteousness aspect, it seems like to me. If I could get critical of the human race for a moment, I tend not to believe in the concept that there are good people. I think people are sort of just varying degrees of bad, and in our own finite way, we sort of judge some as being better than others, but really we're all kind of covetous, lustful, angry, deceitful, backstabbing kind of guys. You know what I mean? And by the way, just because I said guys doesn't mean the girls are exempt. But just the point being, right, that I think when people see something like judgment, or when they see a law that contradicts what they would like to do, it feels a lot of times like a assault on them. And in a way it kind of is, because that is a sort of a part of you. Like, for example, if you have a I don't know, a drug addiction in a way, right? Maybe you really enjoy that drug addiction. Maybe that's a huge part of you hanging out with your friends. Maybe that's a huge part of so many other things that you do, right? And you don't really want to give up that drug addiction. When somebody else is telling you, hey, this is negative for your health. No, that's not only something that benefits me in a hedonistic way, but I almost feel as if that's a part of me. You know what I mean? Because there's so many things that, and I think that's the way a lot of people's sin ends up being, and in a lot of various different ways. And what essentially you end up getting from the Bible is not only the notion that that's wrong, but also and this isn't, of course, the all of it, but there is a lot of this, right? Also the notion that wrongness is so wrong that it's actually worthy of destruction, right? In the case of the Mosaic Code, we have literal stoning to death, right? Which, by the way, is a very brutal way to die, right? It's not a let's execute them in a nice and peaceful way.
And it's not original as well to the Torah law code. It's a common ancient Near Eastern motif, But that's the point. Jeremiah 31 is all about, if the first covenant was faultless, there would be no need to look for a second. But so God's that's not ontologically unique to God. God is basically the Sermon on the Mount. That's who he is.
Well, but even on the Sermon on the Mount, and I agree with you completely, but you notice that, on the Sermon on the Mount, he doesn't throw off Moses. He actually expands Moses, right? So it is true that lusting after another woman is adultery. And it's also true that adultery is worthy of death, right? Jesus never contradicts that point. He says, you've said that thou shalt not commit adultery, and he's not saying, no, you should commit adultery. He's saying, no, but this is what adultery is, right? And I often kind of have pointed out to people, if you think about this, God writes with his own finger that adultery is punishable by death, and then comes down and speaks with his own lips that to even look upon another woman with lust is adultery. And of course, we can put the principle into play. If you're not married and you look upon a woman with lust, okay, well, then fornication, right? But the same principles at play here. So put two and two together, what do you get? Jesus actually, he's being quite rough, right? He's saying to even look upon another woman with lust is to be worthy of the death penalty. That's rough. That's brutal, right? But it is the taskmaster, as Paul says, right? That leads you to understand why you need Jesus in the first place, why there's that savior there, right? Because here's the thing, even though me and you and other Christians out there might want to avoid lust because we love and respect our savior, right? The fact of the matter is that's happened, right? Rob, CJ, anybody else in the live chat who's male, you've looked upon a woman with lust before. It's happened. Just don't even deny it, right? Because it just has. And of course, the women all have with the men, because it's just so easy to do, and especially in a modern age where so many people just don't care about that sort of thing. Well, the penalty for that, according to Jesus, his own lips, would be death, right? But that's the taskmaster. That's what leads you to Christ, to understand we need a savior. It's not of ourselves. Our righteousness is like filthy rags, which of course it is interesting. Jesus doesn't necessarily reveal anything new in that sense, as much as he just hammers home the point that the Old Testament is already trying to make, right? Because you notice even all the way back to Moses, not only is it the death of the most innocent creature you can find, like a ram or a dove or something along those lines, a kid from the goats, right? But also you got to do it again next year or next sin even. Right? Like it's not a fulfilling atonement. In other words, it's an atonement that's temporary. It's an atonement that looks forward to a future atonement. And on one end, it shows you the brutality of what is necessary, right? By having you extinguish the life of this entirely innocent creature. But on the other end, it is that taskmaster in a way that's leading you towards, no, there is an ultimate atonement that will atone you from all of your sin. You know what I mean? And I think that's a hard thing for people because nobody wants to admit that they're a bad guy, right? Plato famously said, know thyself. And it's funny because Plato was a little bit of an egotist, in my own view at least. But if you take him just at his word, do as he said, not as he did, in other words. If one truly does actually know themselves, I think that is the best argument one could make personally to their own self, that the cross is necessary, because when you truly know yourself, you know all the wicked things you're capable of, and that the law does exactly what it needs to do to bring you, sometimes even kicking and screaming, towards the portion of, no, I do need a savior. I can't do this kind of thing on my own. And because of that, even though it is something that it seems like the atheist hyper focus on, it is a necessary component, I think, in that it does give you that living parable, so to speak. And yeah,
what you're doing there is you're describing the end of Romans 7. So what you're doing is that's basically Paul's argument for the first 7 chapters. It's just this huge build-up And at the end of Romans 7, he asks the question, what a wretched man I am, infected with, again, there's the Thanos word, death.
Right.
And who can save me? And then he basically goes, well, I thank Jesus, my Lord. But then notice, he at the end of Romans 7, there's no why thank Jesus? Yeah, I know you're thanking Jesus, but why? And then Romans 8 is that whole, because at the start of Romans 8, he gets into the incarnation and then the build up. And then at the end of Romans 8, nothing can separate us from God's love. Yeah. By the way, Danny in the chat is saying something like something about Star Wars analogies, and I've given, where was that?
Oh,
yeah.
So
you give Star Wars, and I give Marvel. Well, can you screen share the screenshot I just sent you of a Facebook chat I was having with a militant atheist, and I actually use a Star Wars analogy, and I'm interested because if you're a fan of Star Wars, I'm interested to see your reaction to that response.
Yeah, I'm always been. That's actually my favorite fictional story is Star Wars. Specifically the first six. Yeah. I'm not a big fan of Disney.
So I used to be called on this platform. So I came on this platform back when Google Hangouts was happening, and I called myself General Han Solo. So if you actually YouTube General Han Solo with atheist or something, that was my original names because I'm a big Star Wars fan myself. So yeah.
Well, and then so to kind of explain also real quick Danny's comment, I use authorship analogies. So first off, my communicating and teaching, I guess, style, if that's what you would like to call it, is very analogous, meaning I use a lot of analogies because I feel like it's an easy way to make the point. It's almost similar to being, somebody who speaks in parables or fables like Aesop or like a Jesus, right? In that sense, that I just feel like it's a good teaching technique. Not that I would compare myself to Jesus, of course, but just to give an example of other people who use the same kind of a technique. And one of my favorite analogies are authorship analogies, because I think authorship and pet ownership give us two really awesome examples of the operation, in the case of authorship, of a creator with his creation in a narrative sense, and in the case of animal ownership, of a higher being with a lesser being in a companion-like way. And I think both of those things are very good. And so, but to get the analogy point, though, and not so much the pet point, I very often will use Star Wars analogies because it's just a story that everyone knows. You know what I mean? So if I say like if I'll use a free will analogy and I'll say, okay, within the universe of Star Wars, does Luke Skywalker have the free will to choose or choose not to be a Sith?
Right.
All right. This is what it's a good analogy because, of course, the answer is yes. And then I can say, yeah, but in reality, he's a fictional character, right? And then I can go on my whole authorship analogy in its which is an argument in and of itself. My capital THE, the authorship analogy, right? But everybody knows what that means because they've all seen those movies, and so that's why I'll use Star Wars analogies frequently. And I've been, in some instances, mocked for it, like by the Raging Atheist and stuff like that. Jay can't get through anything without mentioning Star Wars. But other people like Danny just are they get my analogies and they find them good fun. So that's just an explanation of that. But nonetheless, we have this on the screen now.
Yeah, feel free to read. So the top comment is an atheist that could. Well, the reason why he's responding is because earlier, I'll just let's see if I can screenshot my earlier, sort of like my deductive argument I gave. So here is my deductive argument. And also I'll give you the stats just to show you how people reacted to that. So there's my deductive argument, which is sort of similar to what I was sharing earlier on about God wanting a family. So my argument was God wanted a family, God was betrayed by his family, God still loved and pursued his family, God is finally reconciled with his family forever. So then this atheist remarks back at me with this argument he gives, and feel free to read it to everyone. Yeah.
So I'm gonna start with the first one. So we got, would you accept someone's family request if they drown? Excuse me, let me restart. If you would you accept someone's family request if they drowned his previous? I think he means previous family with
previous
all
family,
the women and babies, but made a promise he will stop. Would you be a family with someone who sends their son to imminent death as a solution to a problem he created in the beginning and has the power to change things without bloodshed? Would you be family with someone that made a special eternal conscious torment place for you to suffer just in case you don't love them back? I wouldn't. I like my family dull, and if my partner were to act like God and pretend to be love, then I'm divorcing that psychopath, even if I end up dead, buried, or burned by it forever. I'd like to point out that a couple things I would actually.
Yeah,
I won't actually, because let's just read. Let's see. So Rob responds, actually, we were like Anakin Skywalker, who was given an opportunity to have family with the Jedi Council in God's divine council. In the analogy, this is what the Jedi Council is representing, is what he means, right? But through lust of power within the council, as well as with us, the tragedy of self-destruction through terror and death took place. So we became like Darth Vader. Human evil was growing more and more throughout the earth, with every inclination of people's thoughts becoming only evil on a continuous basis. Genesis 6:5. But a new hope, like Luke, or in the literal sense, Jesus, was still going to happen so that we could realize the truth and be freed again. And then he quotes Vader's "Tell your sister you were right." Excuse me. Point. No, I think that is actually rather interesting. And actually, I don't know. I guess I don't know if do you know a lot about George Lucas's? Oh, wrong thing. Do you know a lot about George Lucas's influences for Star Wars?
Yeah, to some extent, like not too much, but to some extent. I guess I could literally verbatim. I mean, this is how crazy it is, because I watched Star Wars so many times. I could verbatim recite what they say, the lines, word for word. But so in other words, I know the movies more than the maker.
Right.
So yeah.
Well, it is interesting because Lucas is actually he does directly parallel the notion of redemption from the Bible. In fact, he himself claimed. Now, granted, I would never affirm this, right? Unfortunately, I think that I would have to, if I ever spoke to him, I would certainly have to call it something like heresy. But he has a religion that he calls Buddhist Methodism, meaning that he affirms a Christian ethic and the existence of a God, but he affirms a Buddhist philosophy and the existence of things like reincarnation, nirvana, and so on. Which, that's neither here nor there, because I don't want to derail this on a conversation of him. But the point being that there's actually a lot of influence that he takes from the Christian story, and I think in a way you sort of picked up on it in that comment. And that it is interesting too. I've noted before, Justin Martyr and C.S. Lewis both have this, and now of course those are philosophers from vastly different time periods, but they both came across the same idea, which is the idea of the quote righteous pagan, right? Mm. And what they mean is, a lot of people will often use those terms to discredit them as heretics, because they think what they mean is that the pagan is somehow justified even though they're a pagan, and that's not at all what they're saying. Lewis explains it better than Martyr, simply because Justin Martyr is writing in the 1st century or 2nd century, excuse me, and it's just much more difficult to understand people who are writing in that time. But the idea basically is that, being that all human beings are made in the image of God, it is impossible for the pagan or the scoffer or the non-believer, whatever you want to call them, right? It's impossible for them to not live out the image of God. Even kicking and screaming their way to hell, they will still manifest the image of God in some way, because they're made in that image and will manifest it to his glory. And I've always found that to be incredibly interesting, because you always see, like, for example, Plato in his idea of moral Platonism, right? It's really fascinating how close to the truth moral Platonism is, because moral Platonism posits that there exists in a realm outside of and greater than our own, a metaphysical realm, if you will, or four-dimensional or supernatural, or whatever term you choose to use, right? There exists in this realm some level of abstract object that actually grounds love, creativity, information, knowledge, reasoning, morality, so on and so forth, right? And therefore gives them a level of objective value. And the interesting thing about that position is the Christian agrees with everything that Plato just said, with one minor difference, which is that the object is a person. Right. And that's really fascinating to me, because here you have Plato, outside of the influence of the Judeo-Christian tradition, getting this close to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And Aristotle afterwards does the same when he talks about the unmoved mover, or the uncaused first cause, as others will say, right? And Antisthenes does the same when he talks about the existence of one ultimate creator God. And a lot of these Greek philosophers, right? You see even the same from Lao Tzu talking about the Tao, right? These guys, they have really solid understandings of the way the world works. It's not salvation worthy. It's not something that saves them, but it is something that's like, you almost can't help but be somebody who lives out the image of God.
I was actually about to bring up the Tao, actually. Now that you mentioned the Tao, like, are you familiar with the Chinese translation of John 1:1?
I am now, yes. I actually became familiar with that actually because of our interaction on SJ's channel, because you had brought up the Logos.
Oh, did I?
This Tao.
Did I? Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't in relation to any of our conversations, but I was still there when you brought it up. And I ended up looking into that, and it makes a lot of sense too. You know, when you think of what
maybe
explain.
Maybe explain to the audience, that concept that I gave on SJ's.
Yeah. So basically, so you have the concept of the Logos, right? And we have to start briefly with the Logos, right? And when John chose the term Logos, he was not inventing a term or using a term that people didn't know. In fact, he was using a term that was very well known in the area of Greek philosophy and already established to be what one might call the divine reasoning, quote unquote, that sort of governed how the world worked. And this idea was postulated by pre-Socratic philosophers, but it really got going under Zeno of Citium, the first Stoic philosopher. And then Philo of Alexandria also has a massive extrapolation of it as well. But you see other people talking about it a little bit briefly as well. Like, you know, Aristotle talks briefly about the Logos. Plato does talk about the Logos. Antisthenes does talk about the Logos, right? And it's this well-established idea of this divine reasoning that sort of keeps everything together like glue, right? And that we can, in a way, tap into to sort of get an understanding of the universe and how it functions, right? And so John comes around and he uses this word to say, so in a sense, you guys are right. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God. And then he kind of throws a plot twist in it that throws all the pagans on their head, which is, and the Logos was God.
And he tabernacles in human flesh.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so it's like, so they're like, we're with you. Wait a minute, what? And it's like, what he's doing is extrapolating. You guys are you're almost, in a sense, getting some of it. But the thing you're not getting is that this Logos, you understand, is indeed a person. And this person is not only a divine person, but a flesh person that came down and dwelt among us and exegetes the Father who is in heaven, right? Well, now, knowing that concept, if you're familiar with Chinese philosophy, and I never put this together, by the way, again, this is actually something that I initially actually got this from Rob. But now that I see it, it's very easy to see, right? You look at Chinese philosophy, what occupies that position in their group, right? What is Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddhist people in Tibet and at the Shaolin Temple and all that? what do they talk about frequently that occupies that same idea as logos in Greek thought? The Tao, right? Or the Tao Te Ching, which most of us usually know in the form of the yin and yang, but actually the yin and yang is only a representation of the Tao. It's not the concept of the Tao itself. The Tao is more better, excuse me, it would be more properly translated as the way.
Yep.
And so, and you know, in the same way that's like the logos, when we say the word, that's true, but that's not necessarily exactly what's meant. Like there's other words for word. The same thing in the sense of the Tao, right? It can represent different things. It can represent literal speech too.
It's sort of like an abstract archetypal ideology. So it's an impersonal rule or something. Like in this case, like you just said, the way.
Exactly.
But then it's like, it becomes very personal in the Chinese translation.
Exactly, because you see that same concept, right, of like the logos thing, where he's like, all right, you Greek philosophers, let me blow your mind a minute. Well, now John's work is translated into Chinese, you know, however long it took, maybe only 100 years even, because it seems like it might have gotten there pretty quickly initially. And it happens all over again because they translate John 1:1 into Chinese, and it's in the beginning was the Tao, and all the Chinese guys are like, yep, we know this. And the Tao was with God. All right, we're on board. This makes sense. And the Tao was God. Wait a minute, what?
And the Tao becomes flesh.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's an awesome thing, actually. That's a quite beautiful truth, I think. And if I misrepresented that or missed anything, do definitely add in.
Oh no. You said it better than I've explained it in the past. And just by the way, I just threw in a quote by Plato. So remember a moment ago I was speaking about Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, the distribution of humans under the other gods.
Yeah.
Now Paul quotes Deuteronomy 32 in Acts 17 on Mars Hill, because he actually introduces this concept of God with the distributed humans. And it's interesting that Plato said that, something very similar in the quote and if you want, you can share it to your audience as well. But in this quote, it's pretty lengthy, but he basically starts by, in the days of old, the gods that had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment, and on it goes with that. So
yeah, and actually I have it on the screen for you guys here. I'm gonna go ahead and read it just so that you guys don't have to actually read it off the screen. But it is on the screen if you guys want to follow along for yourselves. So it says, in the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. There was no quarreling, for you cannot rightly suppose that the gods did not know what was proper for each of them to have, or knowing this, that they would seek to procure for themselves by contention that which more properly belongs to others. They all of them, by just apportionment, obtained what they wanted and peopled their own districts. And when they had peopled them, they tended us, their nurslings and possessions, as shepherds tend their flocks, excepting only that they did not use blows or bodily force, as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of the vessel, which is an easy way of guiding animals, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus did they guide all mortal creatures. Now different gods had their allotments in different places, which they set in order. Hephaestus, I don't know if I said that correct, but nonetheless, and Athene, which I think is Athena. I think these are I know these by different spellings because I recognize that as Athena.
Yep.
What's the
this quotation or this translation is from Plato, Critias 109, the Dialogues of Plato, translation by Jowett, 3rd edition, Oxford, 1892.
Help me out here, Rob. I'm drawing a blank on what we know this H character as. He's the metalworking god, right?
I think so. Let me just bring him up. He's the god of fire, metalworking, stonemasonry, son of Zeus and Hera, and married to Aphrodite by Zeus to prevent a war of the gods fighting for her hand. He was a smiting god, making all of the weapons for Olympus and acting as a blacksmith for the gods.
I almost want to say I don't know. Hephaestus does sound
I think it's
similar.
Hephaestus is how you'd say it, I reckon. Yeah.
Well, so at any rate, to get back to the quote, so Hephaestus and Athena, who were brother and sister and sprang from the same father, having a common nature and being united also in the love of philosophy and art, both obtained as their common portion this land, which was naturally adapted for wisdom and virtue, and there they implanted brave children of the soil, and put into their minds the order of government. Their names are preserved, but their actions have disappeared by reason of the destruction of those who received the tradition and the lapse of ages.
So, when the Greeks already had this in their mind in Acts 17, and Paul comes along and says, hey, in my Jewish literature, well, in this case, the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 32:8 literally says that when the Most High divided up mankind, he apportioned them under the sons of God, or basically you could literally translate that as the gods. And then he basically, as he's chatting, he's just pointing out, there's all these idols because you have different gods with certain jurisdictions and regions. Let me also tell you about this unknown God that you're also talking about, this was the radical claim from Paul. This unknown God supersedes and governs all these other gods that are allotted to all the jurisdictions, and he has chosen a man that will judge the nations. And how do we know we can trust this, or how do we know that he has this prerogative to do that? Because he was resurrected. He's done something that no gods have ever done, this incarnation and resurrection. And I just love how Paul is, or even just that passage in Acts is just so rich. All of Greco-Roman mythology and all of Old Testament history and the Jesus story just lumped in that one discussion. That's why some were just so blown away by it. It's, there's literally, it says some were just sort of, what is this blabbermouth saying? Because they weren't getting it. But then some were sort of, tracking with what Paul was saying, and they believed. And, it literally says, we will hear you further on this matter. This is intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't want to be too abrupt, but I do notice we are a little bit over 2 hours. Yep. Potentially want to get towards the wind down of this for a little bit. Now I do want to briefly recap a little bit in case there's anyone here who has been new. So some of the stuff we sort of went through. So number one, we announced here for the first time, me and Rob will be debating each other on the gospel truth on July the 1st, which should be a Thursday, I believe. And we're going to debate whether or not the flood as taught by the Bible is global, which is my position, the young earth creationist position, that it's over the entire world, or whether or not it was local. And Rob did actually let slip a little bit of his position here today, that he takes the Persian Gulf flood theory.
I'm happy for you to check out my blog posts and videos on that. So,
oh no, I was just being tongue in cheek with that.
Yeah.
I of course, you sort of have revealed my cards as well. So, but nonetheless, so that was the first thing, right? Then we did talk a little bit about the different the different sort of I guess paths that led us to the positions we take here philosophically and worldview wise, as far as why I would take the term strict fundamentalism, and we ended up seeing a little bit of agreement with that, as it turned out, and why we would have the position that Rob takes as far as God not necessarily superseding the rules of nature, but operating by them. And then we went over
he supersedes, but because he supersedes, he can operate with them because he supersedes it. Yeah.
Right. And appreciate the correction. And then, of course, we got into some of the specifics, right? So we talked a little bit about my view versus Rob's view of the of Jericho, which is actually not too dissimilar. And then my view versus Rob's view of the Battle of the Ajalon Valley, which is a little bit dissimilar. But I think there was some good back and forth there for sure. Good conversation. And then, of course, we had what is a pretty solid ending here, I think, as far as talking about the Logos and the Tao, and how those are almost examples of Justin Martyr and C.S. Lewis pointing out the righteous pagan and how God in his sovereignty had John write such a profound thing that could be so profound for so many different cultures, and shake up what they already had sort of laid in some of their foundations. And so that's a recap of where we've been so far today. Anything else you want to add to that recap?
No, I think this discussion definitely. I mean, I considered you a brother. By the way, I just want to clarify. When I asked if you were a Christian on SJ's channel, I wasn't implying or intending like, are you a Christian? Like, I wasn't saying that at all. I was legitimate because I didn't know who you were when you came in. When you came in and when you were asking me about my position, it felt like you were an atheist reacting. And so then when you're saying certain things, then I was thinking to myself, hang on, but that's what a Christian would say. And that's why I asked you the question. But yeah, I'm glad that we've had this discussion, because it just shows when you allow Jesus to be center, which is technically your prayer, how you started this whole thing, which is very good. Like, it just shows that unification takes place. Here you are, you and I, sort of worshiping Jesus in this, which is really good. And I think it was really providential that, I just asked you, I was like, hey, do you want to chat now? And you're like, yep, I can do it now, and it's happened. So that's really good. So
yeah, it was a solid conversation for sure. And we got, at least for my channel, because I'm still only at 346, we got some decent viewage on there too. Up to 14 was the highest, which is not bad for this channel at all. So I appreciate that, because of course you probably have a lot to do with that, being the guest here.
It may have been spicy, but it was spicy in the sense of good meat was discussed between you and me, and that's
for sure. And in case anybody wants, just for the record, if you guys want the biggest points of agreement, was definitely the end, talking about the Logos and the Tao. If you want the biggest point of disagreement, that was probably the Battle of the Ajalon Valley. But nonetheless, it was a great conversation regardless. Yeah, I'm looking forward to potentially, obviously more of these in the future if we can. And that debate too, I think it'll be a solid one. That's going to be two big things, actually, because that'll be not only getting a debate with you, but it'll also be the first time I've been on the Gospel Truth, which I've been wanting to do for some time. Because I don't know how familiar, I guess, you are with my work. I'm always surprised by who is and who isn't, because I know I'm small, but I've also managed to have some really massive conversations. But I've been on Modern Day Debate now probably 13 or 14 times, and debated.
Yeah, I've been on Modern Day Debate twice or three times, maybe three. I've debated Nephilim Free, and I've debated Kent Hovind, and I think that's it. But I find Modern Day Debate, this is no disrespect to James, I mean, I'm friends with James, but I haven't been on the Modern Day Debate maybe 2 years now. And that's purely because it's just so boring. It's just the same, like flat Earth and globe, like 5 debates in a row of just that topic. Right. Over 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's just like, come on. And then on top of that, you have atheist guests coming on, and I know James has, he's giving a platform in the sense that he actually says it. I want everyone to be free and expressive, and but at the end of the day, there's a little bit of too much freedom he's allowing, the disparaging of the gospel, and sort of like basically Jesus or his name is being tarnished. And I know God's sovereign. I know at the end of the day it doesn't matter, because God's bigger than that. But it's just the way the gospel is presented sometimes on the channel. Like, for example, when you debate, or a few others debate, it's rare for the gospel to be sort of like upheld in some sense, but otherwise, when there's so much, when you have amateurs, and I hate to say this, but you just have amateurs coming on the scene and having these discussions and dialogues, it just presents, I guess those who are viewing those discussions and debates are the ones that at the end of the day, they're just cheering for their own side. They're not really there to learn. You see, this is why I prefer Gospel Truth, because at least with Marlon's channel, because I've debated now, I think 4 times on that. So I've actually debated a flat earther on that debate on that channel as well. But my tactic, and if you want, you can check it. Oh yeah, I've debated a Unitarian as well. One of Dale Tuggey's apprentices.
Nice.
But my method is more about education. Like, I care about, here's the data points. This is why I hold to this position. Yeah, I'm not into sensationalist stuff like, ooh, that was a good jab. You know, I mean, I do martial arts. I'm in kendo, but that's also taught me, to be humble about things and not be arrogant and pompous. And
no, and I do see a lot of that, even just because I've often said that there is, and many other apologists before me have said also. Already mentioned Lewis, but also James White is a modern one. If you're not doing apologetics for the purpose A, of glorifying God, and B, of winning the lost, then it's really pointless. And some people do debate for blood sport, for sure. And that happens a lot on modern day debate, where it's like, oh, it's the Christian in one corner weighing into whatever sort of poundage that they're weighing, and then the other corner, you know what I mean? And that's obviously never fun. I think a couple of my conversations there have been really good, but honestly, the ones that I have with relatively big names have been solid. I've talked with Jim Majors, and I've talked with Richard Carrier, and I've talked with David Fitzgerald. And I think from an educational perspective and actually getting a good debate, those are the 3 best I've ever done on modern day debate. And it's interesting because those are probably the 3 biggest opponents I've ever had too. Though I guess one could argue maybe Skylar Fiction and the Raging Atheist are actually bigger than Jim Majors. I guess I don't know where the hierarchy lives, because I know Jim Majors is really well educated, but Skylar and Rage are very popular.
And that's the thing. I just don't care about the popular vote. And I know Jim as well. I'm friends with him. Like, I'd rather talk with Jim than say with Skylar Fiction, though I have also interacted with Skylar Fiction. And when I do interact with Skylar Fiction, or even say someone like Pine Creek, immediately it goes down. And I see this in the side chat as well. Immediately it's this is boring. I'm yawning. This is like too deep, too technical, intellectual. And then I kid you not, there are some comments that says, wow, Rob's, and this is not to be pompous, but this I'm quoting verbatim, Rob's too intellectual for this stuff. Like, here's an intellectual guy and he's believing Christianity. It's like, hello, you just connected the 2 dots, right? I mean, because Christianity is, in fact, everything we just discussed with the Logos and all that, like, obviously it's intellectual. So my intellectual educational upbringing is working in sync with this stuff. That's why I believe it's, yeah. If you want, I can spend the next minute and 2, because I know you want to end this live stream, but I can give you a brief summary of my flood model if you want me to right now, and for your audience as well. I could do that, and then, or if you want the surprise for the debate, I don't know. Like,
I think that could be a solid wrap up, actually. Because my audience will already be fully aware of mine, not only because they, of course, are my audience, but also because of the fact that, to a large extent, though my arguments, of course, are going to be unique just simply because of my own person, I am taking what I think everybody already knows as the YEC position. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, I think that'd be solid. That'll be a good way to wrap this up.
Also, I just remembered you mentioned in your testimony about Moses and Jesus, like Moses could have seen Jesus.
Mm.
I was actually waiting until the end here, and then I'll get to the flood thing in a moment. Go to Hebrews 11. This is just to show you. If you go Hebrews 11 and you read verse 24, well, it starts with verse 23, but specifically the key verses are 26 and 27. What does it say about Moses?
We got Hebrews 11 verses 23 through 27.
But specifically 26 and 27 is the key verses. Yeah,
for sure. And so I'll read the. Well, here let's read those two, and then we'll read the whole thing just to get a context. So he regarded disgrace. This is starting in 26. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead of his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He preserved because he saw him who is invisible. Yeah, and I think that's.
Notice it says the author is literally saying he thought that being insulted for the sake of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, what? Moses had in mind Christ? And
well,
then
it is.
He saw the one who's invisible? That's, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Oh, no. I'm just saying, when you said that, there's the scripture validation of your musings that you already have. That what you were putting together in your own mind, there's a scriptural validation of that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I was just gonna say, it is interesting too, right? When you have John 1:18 talking about that the only begotten Son who's in the bosom of the Father, he has exegeted him, right?
Yeah.
And then you think of how Moses knew the Lord face to face, right? And it's like, huh. So he literally knew Jesus, almost in the same way that the apostles. In fact, you could say literally in the same way that the apostles knew Jesus.
Yeah.
And you just showed us there with the 11 Hebrews 11, 26, 27. That's he's got it. They'd saying it even more specifically, right? No, he's got Christ in mind. But yeah, no, that's a solid verse.
So my flood model. So I'm a theistic evolutionist. I take evolution, even though there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered and so on. But I take it also not just scientifically. I do take it theologically and philosophically. So remember that Romans 8 thing I was mentioning about the creation is groaning, but then Paul says the whole creation will be joined in this resurrection life. So by implication then, just the model itself, if I just import the model back into the early church, and this is how the early church was thinking as well, that means the body of Jesus is stardust, and by implication then is the cosmos. And then you have the hypostasis of the Logos with basically the cosmos, which is the body. So when resurrection happens, it's not just happening to a hominid, Homo sapien being, ontologically speaking. It's actually happening to the whole cosmos, and that's Colossians 1:20. He's able to reconcile heaven and earth through his Son in that one act. So that's how I see, in summary, Genesis 1. So if I do hold to evolution, now immediately Christians will be wondering, but hang on a second, Adam and Eve, how does that work? And I do believe in the historical Adam and Eve, but I do hold to pre-Adamism as well. So I see Genesis 1 as pre-Adam humans, but notice there's no geographical name given of where they are. It's just a generic, general creation narrative. Now, in human anthropology, we do have what's called the out of Africa model, and then humans are migrating into the Persian Gulf. This is about 150,000 years ago. So when they go into the Persian Gulf, a lot of bottlenecking takes place, and the population drops to about 10,000. That's the Genesis 2 story, because Genesis 2 then gives you very specific geographical descriptions, the 4 rivers and all that actually matches with what was once where the head of the Persian Gulf is today. There was no Persian Gulf during the Pleistocene period. So this is about 70,000 years ago, up until about 12,000 years ago. So the Tigris and Euphrates come down, and then the Pishon, Gihon meet across the Arabian Peninsula, and they found riverbeds that are dried out that meet at this location. And it was completely lush. In fact, the anthropologists call it the Persian Gulf oasis. Now, the question then is, why is the Persian Gulf the way it is? Because, I mean, with all that water there, because there was no watery Persian Gulf during the Pleistocene period. So the question is, how did this water come in? And then you have recent evidence of the Younger Dryas event and a few other events where you have the increase of, water increasing and all that. And it's interesting that in the ancient Near East, you have what's called a wind demon that's associated with, and don't forget, all the ancient Near Eastern myths, Sumer, for example, the Sumerian myths, are all again in that Persian Gulf region. It's interesting that you have a possible category 4 or 5 cyclone simultaneous with an influx of literally a tsunami of water, because there's a natural dam that gave way, the tsunami that's filling in this region, and that whole practically 3/4 of the east side of the Arabian Peninsula fills up. That's a deluge, and I can give you the papers on this. It's called the Arabian Deluge, about 12,000 years ago. And at that period in time, if anyone was to survive, they can only survive with what they have. And John Walton brings this out in his books as well. But there's 3 words that when God tells Moses to build an ark, there's 3 words that are very hard to translate. And this is, in King James translation, it says gopher wood. And again, the whole big question is, well, what is gopher? But recent linguistic studies in Akkadian shows that there's a borrowing going on, linguistic borrowing. And in the Akkadian equivalent, it literally means a reed boat. And even today, you have what's called the marsh Arabs. They build maybe like a house equivalent to a 2-bedroom house, just completely out of reeds, and it floats on the riverbeds there. And they even have farm animals inside, like cows and sheep. So if I'm taking this as a very natural reading, like, again, no dinosaurs, nothing, just farm animals and a family, and then you have the ark, or this reed boat that's moving upwards, because the Persian Gulf, Ararat is further north, the water's coming in, hence it's going to push the boat in that direction. Specifically, it's when it says mountains of Ararat, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have a different reading. It says mountains of Urartu. And Urartu, so Ararat is obviously the mountain of Ararat, but you have a region, what's known as Urartu, and all the patristics. So even in the what's called the Peshitta,
I actually have the English translation of that by Lamza.
Of the Peshitta, the Aramaic, right? The Peshitta has Kodu in the original Peshitta rendering. Kodu is a little bit lower than Ararat, but it's still within that Ararat region. And Kodu matches with Josephus, the patristics. Ephraim the Syrian is one guy that can read the Peshitta, for example, and that matches with the ancient Near Eastern location of the Ark's landing. So it's just interesting that the events of Genesis 2, the events of the nod east of Eden, the events of Genesis 6 to 9, then when the ark lands over there, it's still in that Arabian Peninsula region. Then you have Noah and the distribution of the nations, and it says that Noah cultivates, vine cultivation and you in anthropological studies actually see wine distribution starting from the north, going into Eurasia and going out. I just find that whole model completely in sync with the anthropological data and so on. And that, you see, that's a sort of a blend of the first 11 chapters. And again, chapter 11, Tower of Babel, is still in that same region. And Canaan then, so why Canaan? This is going a little bit outside the flood, but the question is, why is God so bothered about Canaan, which is Israel, which is far west from where Eden is? And the interesting thing is, if the Nephilim survived the flood, because Numbers 13, there's an interesting added yod when the spies describe these giants. It says these were of the Nephilim. And Genesis 6:4 repeats in parentheses that, and also afterwards, that these beings were still around. That if the Nephilim escaped towards the Canaan region, well, God's thinking more in line of the cosmic rebellion that's going on. And so that's why, when he's talking to Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, that land over there, I have a bigger purpose as to why I'm sending you there. Yes, you're going to have a family in Israel and so on, but that's become ground zero for Satan. And I'm going to take him out. So Israel invades Canaan. And then the in Jewish tradition, the landing, the so-called landing spot for Satan and his gang, known as the Watchers, are on Mount Hermon. Guess where Jesus says, "On this rock I'll build my church." Caesarea Philippi is Mount Hermon that he's standing on and saying, "This is the gates of hell. This is where it all started in Canaan." And then he goes up that same mountain, gets transfigured. And then in Luke's version, it says that Moses and Elijah were discussing Jesus's exodus. In a lot of translations, it says Jesus' departure. This is in Luke 9. But they're discussing Jesus' exodus that he'll bring about. So you see, this is the overarching thing in regards to the flood and this big narrative flowing forward. And I think in the debate, you might possibly bring up the universalistic language, like all the land, or covering all the mountains. But this is where I'll have to then show you there are other passages in the Bible, like Psalm 104, 2 Peter 2, and 2 Peter 3, that sort of speak about actually localized events and how the biblical authors didn't actually touch on the global aspect of the flood. In other words, geologically speaking, it's global. But yeah, I'm just sharing that. That's kind of like my flood model. I can give you like an 8-minute video with the graphics. Afterwards, after we get off this, I can give you all that stuff. And yeah, I'm just it'll be interesting to see moving forward with the debate. If you have anything that you can share during the debate, that'll be, I'm interested. I'm interested to see if you have anything to share that I can learn from. So, but I'm just sharing based on what I've seen and how it. Yeah, I just find it it's just like, whoa, like it's pretty cool. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that I won't go into too much commentary at the moment, just because I do want to save a lot of that for July the 1st. But I do definitely appreciate having an understanding of your model for sure. And like I said, to give you kind of just a brief overview of mine will be pretty standard. Of course, I aim to have my own arguments and to potentially have a different way of looking at it and stuff like that. So I don't want to say standard in that sense. I'm not about to like go copy standing for truth or something like that, but just to give my model, it is a global flood. It's pretty, I guess, not as much nuance necessarily, you know what I mean? Although there might be nuance as to how exactly it occurred. And
so I'm being very conservative with the scriptures and showing it happening in real time, in real history. In other words, let me put it this way. I know the young creationists will point to, say, the Grand Canyon and all this, like, oh, look, see, you're seeing it in your face. You're seeing the flood, right? But my model is saying, look, if you flew to the Persian Gulf right now, if COVID stopped and we were able to fly, that water you're seeing in that Persian Gulf is the floodwaters. That's how audacious my model is. It's like, look, you're actually seeing the waters in your face. Or you can even Google map it. Like if you go on Google and type Persian Gulf, that water distribution is the floodwaters. That's been there for tens of thousands of years now since then. So.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a really good conversation. That's actually going to be the first debate I've had on any question related to creationism. Actually, I have had a debate on the ethics of the flood, and I've also had a debate on whether or not the Bible teaches a flat Earth. But I've never actually had a debate on. That was an interesting one. It was with a guy named Iger Television, and he agreed that the rules were specifically biblical, because I'm not a scientist or anything like that, So I told him, I was like, look, you can have a science debate with somebody else, but you're claiming that the scripture claims a flat Earth, and so I want to debate you specifically on that. And so he agreed to that. And then he proceeded to not be happy at all when I tried to hold him to no, you can't leave to this, which I'm sure is nonsense anyway, but it's not the point. You can't leave to this different mathematical equation that you just came up with. We're talking about the scripture. And that was an interesting thing that happened for sure. It's probably my least viewed debate though in like my entire career, if you choose to call it that. Right. It's something like 150 views. It's not much, but it was an interesting discussion. But yeah, no, this will actually be my first on the creation topic. Because of the fact that I'm not a scientist, it's one of those things that I stay away from typically. But because of the fact that I think our conversations are more centered in that sense, will probably be more centered around like the scriptural teaching itself, considering it's Christian versus Christian on a Christian channel, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like where the science is, it's not irrelevant, but it's something where it's like it's not so relevant to where like we're going to get in like the super technical details of the Pleistocene or something like that. Because my actual areas of what I would consider to be not expertise but strong points, philosophy, history, politics, and religion. It's my big four, if you will. And I have some interest outside of that stuff, like language and zoology and some cryptozoology and military and stuff like that. But science, with the exception of that zoology, is really low down. By the way, I noticed Iger is actually in the live chat. He said he thought it went really well. And Iger, just so you know, I'm not insulting you or anything like that. It was just that when we had the conversation, I felt that we weren't particularly. By the way, I didn't know that you actually watched this channel, Iger. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. But it was just one of those things where I felt that you wanted to leave the scriptural parameters that we had set up. And also the other problem was just a challenge of specifically of my view when the thesis was supposed to be geared towards your own, which is fine, by the way. I understand that may have just been that one even particular event or something like that. Again, I didn't mean no insult or anything like that. I just felt that the conversation probably could have been held a little bit more in tight parameters, and perhaps it could even happen again in the future. Now that I know that you're here, but nonetheless, we are almost hitting
3 hours.
3 hours, yeah.
But it's been a wholesome discussion, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion I've had with you. So
yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you coming on here today. I appreciate being so impromptu, because that's something that's obviously difficult to do. I have actually at this point today I streamed 2 hours with SJ, or maybe 1 hour with SJ, but then 2 hours with John Maddox, then 3 hours with Nicholas Whitmer, and now 3 hours on my own channel. So I've actually streamed a total of probably 9 hours today. And But nonetheless, it was pretty solid. You know, I've enjoyed all the conversations that I've had today, and I think they were all useful. And I thank everybody who's been following me around and watching the stuff. So what I'll say in closing here is shalom to you all. I want to remind everybody of number one, mine and Rob's debate, which will be July 1st on the Gospel Truth about local flood under the Persian Gulf model, which will be Rob's position, versus a universal or global flood under the traditional young earth creationist model, which will be my view. And I don't know exactly how Marlon plans to word it, but we'll see who ends up having to take the affirmative or whatnot. But that's the positions, right? Also want to announce, though, a lot more soon than that, right? Because that's obviously July 1st. I will be having a interview, again, to remind you guys all, with David Rowe on the Exodus and his new chronology, as well as Mosaic existence. And that's going to be on April the 15th at 8 a.m. Mountain Time. So definitely check into that. The following week, I will be talking to Bruce Gore, and he'll be pitching the case not against Roll, but for his own position, which is the conventional chronology and an Exodus happening in the conventional chronology around 1446 BC, which both of them agree on that part. It's just the Egyptian chronology that's the main difference. And I have confirmation now from Chris Date that we will, though we don't have a date, ironically enough, we will actually be able to have a conversation on the issue of hell. And we might also have an interview with Matt Slick soon, as well as a potential debate with Matt Slick soon, which would be two separate events. And by the way, I live in the same city as Matt Slick, so that might be an in-person informal debate. So we'll see what happens with that. That would be fun if it was. But nonetheless, those are all the announcements we have for you guys. I have a couple other things I might announce soon, but can't announce them yet because there's nothing that's set in stone or even close to set in stone. So just wanted to remind you guys of all of that. And definitely, if you want to get more of what I'm doing here, you can subscribe. You can obviously hit that bell to be notified every time we're going live. Get me on all the different social media platforms you're on, because I am on virtually all of them. Twitter, Gab, Parler, Minds, whatever. And you can, of course, help us out here on Patreon if you feel that my work is worth it. But also, I had a guest today. So if you go to Sentinel Apologetics here on YouTube, you will also be able to find my guest, Rob, and what he does here on YouTube and his different discussions and podcasts, which I guess is what you would call what we do here on YouTube. But nonetheless, over there, and again, that's Sentinel Apologetics. I think he did actually have a few comments in the live chat, so you might just be able to click the live chat there and go straight to his channel. But it's a pretty large channel, actually, about 42,000 subscribers, if I'm not mistaken. So it shouldn't be hard to miss once you look it up, and definitely check that out if you're trying to get more of a deep view into Rob and what it is that he believes. And anything else that you'd like to say before we head out?
No, that's it. I appreciate basically the brotherly love in this, and we've had this discussion. I think it was a very mature thing we both did. In fact it shows our maturity in the faith. That, like, obviously there's the, you approach the debate, debate me on those topics, right? But you see, it's so sad when people go into debates because they just want to debate and win it. And I knew that you were different, and that's why why not just have one of these discussions? It could have been offline, could have been online, doesn't matter. But the point is, have a discussion beforehand. And yeah, there's like a kindred spirit. So in other words, going into the debate, it's not like the modern day debate. It's actually a genuine brothers debating. In this case, you hold to a global flood, I hold to a local flood. I'm sharing you material well in advance for you to chew on. And yeah, like, I'm all for that sort of interaction in these debates.
And on that note, too, I would like to point out, when I do collect my sources, because I am getting in the habit now of writing out my opening statements. And so I'll have a collection of sort of sources that, you know, I set up like my own bibliographies when I do this. I will actually send that to you pre-debate also, just in the name of, you know, giving you the opportunity to come up with the counter arguments that you might want to come up with or something like that.
Yeah, I'm fine. Yep. Also, I just sent, so in the messenger, this is after in your own time. I sent you well, I'm not going to use those lecture slides in the debate, but I'll probably tweak it. But that's the full lecture slides I gave. So I gave a talk, an academic talk at my university. It was in front of geologists and physicists and all that, and most of them were Christian as well. So that's the nose flood talk. The other PDFs I've given you is what I've dubbed the Sentinel commentary on Mark and Revelation. So I actually took my church in 2018 to 2020. It took me 2 years to write the Revelation one. But Mark is still a work in progress, so we're going through Mark at the moment. So it's up to Mark 7. But those two commentaries will give you a taste of what I do in my own private life, in my own devotional Christian life. And I hope it'll be a blessing to you as well, if you do read it. So, yeah. And that's all I have to share. And I've also given you the 8-minute video summary of the flood model, and there you go. I've just sort of dumped everything for you. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that a lot. And let me say, so in closing for you guys, just to say, and also to Rob, God bless you. Of course, in the name of our Lord and Savior, whose name is Jesus Christ, that is Yeshua HaMashiach, Jehovah saves, and of course, he is the anointed one. And so, you know, just whatever you do, of course, glorify God in all things. And we will be catching up with you guys here very soon.
Amen.